Good morning, everyone. I appreciate all the housekeeping items that you just went through, Jen. I don't know if we have participants that are joining today that were not with us yesterday, but I will give a brief introduction with Alan Fetterman, our speaker, again today. So this is day 2 of our not-for-profit update. And Alan has been a speaker with us for a number of years. I think last time we counted, Alan, we're probably up to 20 years at this point.
It's getting close. It's getting, I think
It
it's
is, yes.
2003, so this could be the 19th year.
Okay, so 19 years. Alan has been joining us. I think for those that have participated in some or all of those years, Alan is a retired partner from a CPA firm, spent his career specializing in serving not-for-profit organizations, is a expert in the field, and certainly since his retirement, and I always use those words loosely, that he really never retired. He just transitioned his role from a CPA firm partner to really a full-time presenter with the subject matter knowledge of not-for-profit in various topics beyond just audit and accounting updates, as today's presentation that starts us is on good governance. So certainly is an expert in the field, and we're always happy to have him come and share his expertise and make us better client servers, and then also for the clients and other friends of our firm that are joining us. I think it gives us a very broad insight into the work that we all do. So if we are ready to get started, I will turn it over to Alan, and we can get going for today's 4-hour presentation. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning to everybody. This is day 2 of the not-for-profit workshop. Yesterday, we talked about some accounting and auditing topics. Today, we're going to start off with a 2-hour, that's a 100-minute presentation on good governance for not-for-profit organizations. After a 10-minute break, we'll have 2 50-minute presentations. The first one on the nonprofit audit risk alert for 2021, which I mentioned a few times yesterday. And this year, it's going to concentrate on the risks related to COVID. And then we'll finish up the day with a tax session. We'll talk about tax-exempt status jeopardizing activities. So this will be a deeper dive into what you should not do unless you want to jeopardize your tax-exempt status. All right, so let's start with good governance for not-for-profit organizations. And before I get into the slides, I want to tell you a little story. And this is a true story. A number of years ago, for a period of about 5 years, the CEO and other officials of a New York City community-based not-for-profit youth center did the following. It siphoned off approximately $290,000 for their personal benefit. Now, it may not sound like a lot, but this was probably 25 years ago, so you can double that in today's dollars. Also, the organization lent $875,000 unsecured to one executive's private business venture without informing the board. And of course, in order to cover it, they routinely falsified records. The key to this is that the board was oblivious, and I use that word quite intentionally. The board was oblivious to how the organization was actually being managed, and they were unmindful of their fiduciary responsibilities. And this is what left the organization exposed to these unethical actions, a loss ultimately of over $1 million. The board just accepted whatever the CEO stated. They were uncritical of the CEO. They took no independent action to monitor their organization's financial condition. If they had done something, they would have seen that cash was being dissipated. The treasurer, in fact, stated, and this was during the trial, the treasurer stated that he had no particular responsibilities and took no interest in financial records and reports. The board was unprepared to govern the organization and oversee this dominant CEO. And in fact, cases like this and many others have shown over the years that long-running frauds and abuses by not-for-profit insiders are often associated with the absence of board oversight. Now, that story I usually tell at the beginning of a session that I do on fraud at not-for-profit entities and not good governance and internal controls, how even smaller not-for-profits can establish internal controls. And the reason I wanted to begin with that this morning is because when we talk about good governance, we're talking about board involvement. And when we talk about board involvement, we cannot separate that concept from the concept of internal controls. Because if the board is not involved somehow in controlling the activities of the organization, then they're not functioning as a board, they're not fulfilling their fiduciary responsibilities. So with that in mind, let's turn to the slides. Now, you saw this one already. And what I want to stress is, if you have any questions, or especially in this session, when we're talking about governance, where it's not as cut and dried as accounting, GAAP and gas, if you have any comments, even just thoughts, please enter them into the chat box, and Jennifer and I will be looking at it. I'll be glancing over periodically. If you see me look to my left, although I think for you on the screen, it looks like I'm looking to my right because everything is mirror image. If you see me looking to my left for a moment, it means I'm looking at the chat box. So please, if you have questions or thoughts or comments, send them on over. Let's make this an interesting discussion if we can. So, good governance is not only statements of policy, but actions. Policies do no good if there aren't actions behind them to enforce the policies. I'm right now involved well, I'm on the board of more than one nonprofit, but one of them, which is a $5-6 million organization, we're having a discussion about certain policies that have been set where voted by the board, proved it as a policy, but they're not going to enforce it. And I'm trying to argue with them that then it's not a policy, it's a suggestion. A policy is something that is enforced, and the board has to stand behind their policies and enforce them. In this session, we will review the components of good governance, maybe even great governance. Many, many years ago, when I first retired in 2003, the former managing partner of my firm asked me to write a paper for the firm that they would use as a marketing tool called Going from Good Governance to Great Governance. Quite honestly, it was a very sexy title and it sold very well, but I don't know if there's a difference between good or great governance. So I'm going to look at good governance as the same as great governance in this session. This will include transparency in all aspects of operations. The board has to be totally transparent with what they're doing. Strong board oversight of all areas of the organization. The board is not just there to rubber stamp and approve what the CEO and the CFO are doing. There must be an ethical tone set by the board. If the board doesn't set the ethical tone, well, that kind of leaves the CEO, the CFO, in fact, even middle-level management, kind of makes them feel that they're free to maybe not be so ethical themselves. And of course, the need to manage financial responsibilities through the use of audit committees. And we'll spend some time later on talking about audit committees and how they function and what role they should play. So in the past, and when I talk about in the past, I'm talking about during my career when I was a partner at my firm here in New York City. Individuals sat on many boards. And why was that? Why were people joining nonprofit boards? To meet other people, to network. They were looking at it as a business opportunity. Let's meet other people. Maybe we can make sales to them, or maybe we can bring them in as clients for whatever we were doing. We're an attorney, we're an architect. And by serving on nonprofit boards, we were hoping to somehow benefit our business. But if you look at a lot of nonprofit boards, the same people attended the monthly or the bi-monthly meetings. Only a few interested members attended meetings. Many people didn't attend the meetings. And back then, we didn't have the ability to call into meetings. We certainly didn't have Zoom or Teams, but we also, very few organizations had the ability to have board call in even via the telephone. So what happened because of that? Management played a large role in running the organization. There was very little board oversight, and management knew that. The CEO was the king of the organization. The CEO controlled. I had a few clients where the CEO was totally dominant, and I knew the board was not meeting their financial or fiduciary responsibilities. And because of that, there was minimal reporting to the board. I mean, sure, every board meeting, the CEO would make a report about what he or she did over the past month. And if something needed approval, the board would approve it. And it was usually, if not unanimous, darn close to unanimous. That was the past. What's happened in the present? Support of mission has become the driving force of board service, not self-service, but support of mission. Boards now understand the importance of good governance, including the board's responsibility, fiduciary responsibility to the organization, the need for accountability, the need for constant reform and updating of structure, controls, and oversight, and review and scrutiny of management. Now, how do I know this? I am in frequent contact with some of my former partners, younger partners, actually young partners that I hired straight out of college back in the early and mid 1980s, who were still active in the firm, and or other firms, as the case may be, and they tell me what's going on today with boards. It is totally different than when I was active in the firm back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. Boards are much more aware, not only of their fiduciary responsibility, but they're aware that auditors can be a great resource for them in helping them meet their fiduciary responsibility, both individually as individual board members and as a conglomerate of board members, as a board as a whole. And they've also told me that they're spending more time with board people on the phone, on Zoom, at meetings, than they ever did years ago when I was there. What happened? Why did boards' attitude and approach change? Well, number of reasons. There were a lot of high-profile governance-related failures. Remember, in the corporate world, I'm sure many of you remember Enron and WorldCom. These were organizations, very successful, for-profit, publicly traded corporations, which went belly up because of fraud that was taking place within the organization, and the boards had no idea what was going on. So nonprofit organizations looked at them as an example of what could go wrong if the boards were not involved. There were some very lesser high profile, but certainly high profile nonprofit organization frauds, the big one being the Baptist Foundation of Arizona, which was basically a Ponzi scheme, in which time the Baptist Foundation lost $500 million, if I'm not mistaken, over a period of time. The United Way, both the national organization where the CEO was paying himself a lot of money that was not approved by the board, and also local chapters. There was a big one in the DC area. I think it was the Washington chapter of United Way. And there were many others that I go through in another session on fraud. But these cases started to change the board's attitude and approach toward what their responsibility was as board members and as a board as a whole. Then Sarbanes-Oxley happened. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley was originally, after Enron and then WorldCom, was passed to help for-profit, publicly traded corporations govern themselves. Well, the nonprofit sector acted. They impaneled the panel on the nonprofit sector. I won't go into the details of how they were impaneled and who was on it and what they did and how the study was conducted, but they came up with 33 principles of good governance. And I'm going to tell you, even though that was by now probably 15 years ago, it is still applicable today. And I still would suggest that anybody who wants to read up on good governance, go online, go into the panel on the nonprofit sector. It was the blue ribbon panel on the nonprofit sector, or look up the 33 principles of good governance. Something that I did when I was on the board of the local United Way. We went through the 33 principles. I was at the time chairing the audit committee, and we went through it with management and a couple of other board members, and to see which of the principles we had already adopted, which ones we had not and should, and if there are any that didn't apply. turned out it was pretty good. We probably had adopted about 29 of the 33 principles, and then we decided to adopt 2 others, and there were 2 that didn't apply to us. So that's still a good thing to look at. And frankly, it was also, talking now specifically to a CPA, an accounting firm that does consulting. It's a great value-added service to our clients to talk with each of them about the 33 principles to see which ones have been adopted by the board and which ones have not. The IRS started to scrutinize board oversight in the nonprofit sector. Many of you remember when the 990 was redone several years ago, they added a lot of questions about board oversight. And of course, public outrage, the coverage by the financial press, and the financial press loves to get a hold of these frauds, especially in the nonprofit sector. They like to somehow show that nonprofits are not being properly managed. And by the way, if you get covered by the financial press in the nonprofit sector, what can happen? Loss of reputation. Reputation is a nonprofit's most valuable asset. And once it's lost, it's very hard to regain. It takes a long time. Of course, once you lose reputation, then you could start losing some funding from individuals, foundations, etc. So what is good governance? Well, in my mind, it's transparency. And it's transparency in all aspects of operations. Nothing should be hidden from the board by management. Management has to be totally transparent with the board, and the board has to be totally transparent with management and with their constituents. Nothing should be hidden from funders, regulators, and constituents. If something is going on that impacts on potential funding, it should be disclosed. Strong board oversight should be available in all areas of the organization, not only finance, but mission and administration. The board has to be involved. This is a consistent message you'll receive during this session. Board involvement is key to good governance. An ethical tone needs to be set by the board. I mentioned that before. Management staff should know what is expected of them. I mentioned also that good governance is not only statements of policy, but actions, because policy alone is not sufficient. Actions must conform to policy. If the board sets a policy, the board must be prepared to either enforce the policy or change the policy. It is not a good idea to have a policy that's not being enforced, because the message that gives to management is that the board will not stand behind their own actions. The overarching principle for effective boards is to leave the organization in a better position than you found it. In other words, when you join a board, it should be your goal to serve that organization. And when you leave the board, whether it's in 2 years or 22 years, it should be in a better position than when you joined the board. It's essential to effective board service to reduce the many ambiguities that accompany board service. Board members should always understand what their responsibilities are. I mentioned I serve on the board of Center for Safety and Change here in Rockland County, New York. It's a crime victims organization. I've just been asked to join the governance committee, which is a newly formed committee made up of the chairs of the standing committees. I chair the audit committee, so I've been asked to serve on the governance committee. Our first job is defining the responsibilities of board members individually and the board as a whole. And, anytime you put 8 people together, especially when it's on a Zoom meeting, which makes it harder than an in-person meeting, but when you try to come up with responsibilities of board members, who have eight people, all of whom think they know what the responsibility should be, you end up with a conglomeration of responsibilities that have to be pared down. So it's not an easy job, but we're going to come up with a single sheet that's going to disclose or describe the responsibilities of board members individually and the board as a whole. And it's going to be a good document. And once we have it, I'll be glad to share it with anybody who would like to see it. Also, Training of board members and the board as a whole is essential to their understanding. It is absolutely essential that when somebody joins the board, they are trained as to what their responsibilities are and what the responsibilities of the board as a whole is. That means time has to be spent by somebody. Someone has to be appointed, one of the board members, as a mentor to new board members to train them as to their responsibilities. You can't expect someone to join a board and just come to the first meeting cold and know what's expected of them. And it's more, and it's in addition to responsibilities as fiduciary responsibilities. There might be financial responsibilities. Maybe there's a give-get policy. There might be attendance responsibilities at events. So it's more than just the fiduciary management responsibilities. Board members have to be told what's expected of them. And quite frankly, new board members should be, potential board members should be told all the responsibilities so they know whether or not they want to join the board. If the organization has a give-get policy, which I am not in favor of generally, potential board members may not feel comfortable joining the board. We may lose a potential board member because of that, but they should be told up front, not later when they join the board. Every organization is different. There are, however, fundamental responsibilities that hold true for every board. Large boards, small boards, national boards, local boards, whether they're, excuse me, whether they're funded by contributions or other sources like fee-for-service revenue. No matter what kind of organization, there are fundamental responsibilities. Excuse me. How boards and board members actually fulfill the responsibilities, that will vary depending on the organization's size, structure, and history. Large organizations, national organizations, certainly will be managed in a different way than smaller local organizations. In fact, what makes an organization smaller? Because that's a term I like to use, smaller organizations, not small, but smaller. I'm going to read you something on the definition of a smaller not-for-profit organization. Because, and remember, smaller is comparative. We don't use the word small. But any community-based nonprofit is considered a smaller organization, smaller than the national and regional organizations. It involves a board that is active in governing the organization. The board may not have members with financial expertise in a smaller organization. The CEO, and think about your clients or your organizations, the CEO frequently is a former program person, not someone who grew up in management. And that leads to certain other problems within the organization surrounding internal controls, but that's not our message today, so I'm going to stop at that point with that. There's no one model of management, of board management, that's proven itself viable in all circumstances, but there has been a body of knowledge that has evolved that argues for certain structures, policies, and practices that consistently work better than others, and that's what we're going to be discussing in this session. All organizations undergo a metamorphosis. Let's see, we have a question. No, we don't. All organizations undergo a metamorphosis that calls for periodic evaluation, fine-tuning, and sometimes major overhaul of their governance structure. There are a few things we should know. The world of business is constantly evolving. Think about what's been going on just this past year because of COVID. Boards used to meet in person, and maybe one or two who couldn't be there in person would call in on a phone. Now, boards are meeting virtually on Zoom or some other virtual platform. And that changes the dynamics of the meeting. I don't care what anybody says. I do not feel that the meetings on Zoom are as productive as they were when we were meeting in person. We weren't really interacting in the same way. A board is made up of individuals, but there must be interaction among the individuals to enable the board as a whole to perform its functions properly. And we're losing that. we're losing that ability by having virtual meetings. So that's an evolution. That's a negative one, and it's a challenge to most organizations to keep the boards active and involved. I will tell you that on the one board that I serve, one charitable board that I serve on this year, since the pandemic started, our attendance at meetings has been cut significantly. We have approximately 28 board members. We used to average 20, 22 board members at a meeting in person. Now we're averaging 14, 15, 16. So there's a significant reduction there. Nonprofit organizations and their boards need to keep current in what's going on. They need to keep current in understanding programs that the organization is running, any new programs, any new funding that they're getting, loss of funding. They also need to keep current with what's going on in the economy, the nonprofit sector in general, the nonprofit sector in their local community. These are responsibilities of board members in addition to just attending meetings. Attending meetings is certainly required, but that's the minimal requirement. Organizational performance, just like human performance, is cyclical in effectiveness and needs renewal as it evolves over time. And we're going to talk sometime later in this session about how long board members should serve. Should there be a required turnover, or should you keep effective board members on for as long as they're willing to serve? All right, we come to the first keyword, and that is risk. Risk, R-I-S-K. Keyword number one, risk. I'll give you about 30 seconds to write it down, and you must write it down because you'll be required to put it on the valuation after the session is over. Last time, keyword one is risk. Okay. Continue with some basic assumptions about board responsibilities. Boards and board members perform best when they exercise their responsibilities primarily by asking good, timely questions, rather than by just managing programs or implementing their own policies. It's essential that boards ask questions. Look, I asked yesterday and again this morning, if you have any questions, please send it into the chat room. This is not meant as a criticism, it's just a statement of fact. Yesterday, there was a total of one question. And the reason is, again, this virtual nonsense. Unfortunately, people, when they're sitting in front of their computers, they're less likely to raise questions, while if they're in a room with a lot live and in person, they're more likely. And I think it's the same thing now with virtual board meetings. Boards are just not asking questions like they used to. But it's absolutely essential that they do, because that's how board members learn. And a board member should never feel embarrassed to ask a question feeling, well, that might be looked at as a silly question. No, there are no such thing as silly questions. All it means is you may not understand something. That doesn't make you silly or stupid. It makes you intelligent enough to realize you don't understand something and you want more background, or you want a better explanation. So it's essential to ask questions. The relationship between the board and management tends to be strongest when expectations are mutual and responsibilities are clear. It's up to the boards to set strategy and direction, not management. That is not management's function. That's a board function. Management then should implement board directives. If the board sets a strategy, management should figure out ways of implementing that strategy. But at the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, boards should avoid micromanaging. So somehow boards need to find a place for themselves where they set strategy, they set direction, but they don't get involved in the weeds. They allow management to implement their directives, and they avoid micromanaging. One of the worst things a board can do to a good CEO is micromanage the CEO. CEO was hired to run the organization, based on board directives and strategy. So here are some key governance areas. Recruiting board members who are engaged and highly skilled. We, and this one organization whose board I sit on right now, it's the only charity I sit on for that matter. We have a committee who is charged with recruiting board members throughout the year. We don't just elect board members once a year. As people rotate off the board, we're constantly looking for potential board members. And if there's no position at that moment on the board, we'll still recruit people and tell them sometime within the next several months or a year, we would like you to join the board. But by recruiting them and interviewing them throughout the year, constantly, year after year, month after month, we're going to have a reserve of board members who we feel will become engaged in the board and have skills that they can bring to the board. We are always looking, by the way, just to let you know, always looking for another CPA type person to serve on the board. I mean, I chair the audit committee, but there's no accountant or CPA on the finance committee. There are financial people, they know numbers, they understand budgeting, but we constantly are looking for another accountant to serve on the finance committee. Training those board members on how to provide effective oversight. Now, that can be done by what's called an onboarding project, where as people join the board, they're trained as to what their responsibilities are with regard to fiduciary oversight and what other responsibilities might be. But it also means that maybe to have some sort of board retreat periodically, whether it's annual or every 2 years is, of course, a judgment call, but that's part of training. And when you have a board retreat, it's a good idea to have a paid professional facilitator so that the training, this board retreat really becomes an effective training. If you have someone speaking who knows what they're talking about, not just another member giving his or her opinion on what the board should be doing. Retaining board members and keeping them engaged throughout their tenure. This is really important, keeping board members engaged. If you don't get board members to get involved with the organization, then they're going to lose interest. And it must be interesting. People don't want to do things that are not interesting. Most people will shy away from doing things where they're bored. And what will happen if it's not interesting, they'll stop attending meetings. And then after several months, all of a sudden they'll resign. You'll wonder, I wonder why Joe resigned. Because we weren't keeping him involved and it wasn't interesting. Should be challenging also, but if it's not, I'm going to even use the word fun. If it's not fun, if it's not enjoyable, people are not going to want to do it. Then it's just work. Work is something we have to do. Joining a board is something we want to do. Some challenges in recruiting board members. The position description is not appealing at first glance. I mentioned that we're writing up a board responsibility sheet, individual board members and responsibility of the board as a whole, which is really a description of the position. It's a job description. Candidates are also often asked to spend many hours fulfilling their governance duties. Remember, these are volunteers. You want to make it interesting, you want to make it challenging, but you don't want to make it burdensome. There is just so much you can ask volunteers to do before they say, too much. I didn't sign up for this. And obviously there's a fine line between just enough and too much. And it's a judgment call. And it's the responsibility of the board as a whole, but specifically the board chair or president and the committee that sets a governance committee, if they have one, to make sure that board members are not being burdened. Many times, board members are required to donate their own money or solicit contributions on behalf of an entity. I mentioned before a give-get policy. I am not a great fan of a give-get policy for community-based organizations. National organizations, that's different. But community-based organizations, people from the community are generally not necessarily well off. You know, they get by and they lead a nice life, but they don't have a lot of excess money. And if you set a policy, the word required implies a policy to donate X dollars a year, or if you don't have to donate, solicit contributions from your friends and relatives. A lot of people don't want to do that. So that is a real big challenge. We recently tried to recruit, I said we're looking for an accountant. I identified a CPA who lives here locally in Rockland County. She's she's a manager at a large regional firm based in the New York City metropolitan area. And the clientele that she handles are nonprofit organizations. So she was a perfect person to bring on the board. But she's a young woman with a family, and when she was told that we have a give-get policy, she backed off. And she told me on the QT that was one of the reasons she backed off. She was looking forward to joining the board, but when she was told that she has to give or get a certain amount of money, she said, I don't want to do that. I can't give that kind of money, and I do not like to ask people for contributions. I don't want to go to my friends and relatives. So give-get policy can be good, but it could be actually create a real challenge to recruiting board members. But there are some benefits that we can tell potential board members. Through their service, they will contribute to a good cause. That is, they'll have this feel-good factor. I feel good when I'm serving a nonprofit organization, even when it was the board of the New York State Society of CPA, certainly not a charity. But I had a feel-good factor on the board because I knew I was serving my profession, at least the profession in New York State. So yeah, great way of recruiting people. Tell them how good it will make them feel. Board service can also provide leadership skills, networking opportunities, and prestige. No doubt about it. I've served on many boards and I've learned a lot. I've also met a lot of people, and at times I've benefited from that networking. Prestige, not so much. Keep in mind, what is the expertise that you need the board to have as a whole? You don't necessarily need to recruit each board member that has expertise in one particular area, finance or technology or the entity's mission, but you want to get all these skills in a conglomerate. The board as a whole should have expertise in finance, expertise in technology, knowledge of the importance of the entity's mission. But each board member doesn't have to have all of these. And diversity of the board is very important, especially in a community-based nonprofit. We need diversity in professional background and experience, accountants, attorneys, teachers, social workers, and I can go on, psychologists. And it's great to have that kind of professional background diversity. Race and ethnicity, gender and age. These are sensitive topics, but it's achievable. It's something that the committee that is recruiting board members should keep in the back of their minds. If the community is racially diverse, the board should represent the community, and therefore the board should be racially diverse. Now, I will tell you that our board, the one I've spoken about several times, is very diverse. Rockland County is an extremely diverse county as far as racially and ethnicity-wise, extremely diverse, and so is our governing board. Gender, also a good idea to try to get to get a gender diversity and an age diversity, but that is, I think, it's just as important as racial and ethnicity diversity, maybe a little bit less, but all of these, it should be a goal. And it's not easy to achieve diversity in all four of these areas, but it can be done with careful planning. I mentioned new board members should be trained. So they should be indoctrinated as to their responsibilities. They should meet with the CEO and other key members of the management team. The board should know who the management team are, what their background is, who they are, so they recognize them, and they can speak with them. And this way they may feel comfortable calling them. When I joined the board that I've been on now for 3 years, I met with the CEO and at that time, and I got to know her, learned to respect her knowledge and her drive, which is tremendous. Also learned what I thought maybe was some weak points, but that's okay. Everybody, no, not everybody is strong in every facet of management. Board members should be provided with a binder that describes all the background that they need to know in order to serve effectively. A history of the organization, what the organization's mission is, and what are its programs. A copy of the bylaws of the organization, which should be read. This binder is not given just to file away. They should be reading all of these things, and new board members should be told they should be reading these things. A board and committee list, so they know who their fellow board members are. They should be aware whether we have a D&O, a directors and officers liability insurance policy. So a copy of that policy should be in that binder. There should be an employee handbook, so every board member knows what policies are for employees, what they can do, what's expected of them, what they should not do. As simple as how many days vacation, what holidays are we closed. These are things that board members should know. You may think of it, well, it's not very important. It is, because board members should understand what employees are doing and what they're going through in their professional lives. And there should be an employee contact information, at least the CEO, CFO, or COO if applicable, and then department heads, name and contact information. When I joined the board of Center for Safety and Change, I'm looking at it now up on the shelf. I have it's a 4-inch binder that I was given, loaded with all sorts of information. And over the 3+ years I've been there, I've put a lot of other information into it, things that I've been involved in at the organization. So it's getting pretty full at this point. Board members should understand the difference between management functions and board functions. Remember, we talked about it before. The board is responsible for strategic direction and policy. The board is responsible for oversight of the entity's strategic plan. It's responsible for CEO succession, and it's responsible for risk management. Management is responsible for executing those plans and providing them to the board for review. And we're going to talk in a little while about individuals' board responsibilities, including CEO succession. So here are what is considered, or what are considered, the 10 basic responsibilities of nonprofit boards. I'm going to read them, and then we're going to go into each one and take a dive into it. Boards have to determine the organization's mission and purpose, and that could change. We have changed our mission statement in the past year because we decided that the mission was old. Our mission has expanded over the years, so we changed the mission. And remember, the mission goes on to your 990. You're supposed to disclose your mission. So keep it current. Select and monitor the chief executive. Keywords there: select and monitor. Provide proper financial oversight. More on that coming up. Ensure adequate resources. That means ensure that the organization has sufficient revenues to support its programs. Ensure legal and ethical integrity and maintain accountability. Ensure effective organizational planning. Recruit and orient new board members and assess board performance. We touched on that already. Enhance the organization's public standing. Remember, we talked about reputation. I said it's probably an organization's most valuable asset, and once it's damaged, it's hard to recover. Determine, monitor, and strengthen the organization's programs and services. Yes, boards should be involved in programs and services, but only at the highest level of oversight. And support the chief executive and assess his or her performance. So let's start talking about the 10. Mission and purpose. It is the board's responsibility to create and review a statement of mission and purpose that articulates the organization's goals, means, and primary constituents served. To the board, mission is primary. It's the reason for the organization's existence. Without mission, there is no organization. There's no reason for the organization. And if the organization's mission is outdated, then update it. Commitment to the organization's mission should drive the board's sense of accountability. It's the number one reason today that people join boards. They want to support the mission. People ask me, why did you join this board? I say, to support the mission. Now, I am not a program person. I admit that. I am non-creative when it comes to programs, and I stay out of the program area. I'm an analytical guy. I'm a CPA. You all know what that means because that's why you're here today. I'm very analytical. I'm not creative, but I do know that mission is primary. And everything that I do in the area of management and financial oversight, I chair the audit committee, is to support the mission. Even though it's not a direct support of the mission, it supports the mission. The mission and purpose should serve as a guide to organizational planning, board and staff decision-making, volunteer initiatives, and setting priorities among competing demands for scarce resources. And I said before, mission is primary. The mission should drive all decisions made by the board, and board members should never lose sight of the mission. And one way board members will never lose sight of the mission is if they're constantly reminded by the chair of the board and by the CEO that mission is primary, and everything the board does should at least have in the back of their minds, how will this support our mission? How will this decision, how will setting this policy, how will setting a give-get policy support the mission? And there is a dotted line between it. Even though I'm not a fan of give-get, I can see that how it will support the mission because it will create an incentive on the part of board members to bring in more resources. More resources means more money available to spend on program, and that's how it supports the mission. That's just one example. Select and monitor the chief executive. So the first thing we should do if you're on the board is reach a consensus on what the CEO's responsibilities are. And there should be a detailed job description, used both in recruitment and monitoring. When you're recruiting the CEO, or a replacement for the CEO, which by the way, I think we all know should be done before the CEO retires. Not always done that way, unfortunately. But when you're interviewing people, you should show them a detailed job description. Once you get past the initial interview where you're really finding out if this person has the right personality, will fit in well, and has the background and experience for the job, then you should give this person the job description in writing and let him or her decide if it's a job that he or she wants. Maybe not. You don't want to hire someone who doesn't want to be there. So it's a good idea. Undertake a careful search to find the most qualified person for the position. Try not to compromise. Sometimes boards get frustrated or search committees get frustrated because they're searching already for months. They haven't found the right person. The CEO is scheduled to retire in 2 more months. They thought they had enough time with a half a year. It turns out we're approaching the date already. So they start to compromise. Well, try not to compromise. Maybe you'll have to pay a greater compensation than originally planned. Remember the old phrase, you get what you pay for. You have to pay a CEO appropriately. And you try to undercut, and this goes for any management position. We hired a CFO a year and change ago, and I felt the compensation was too low, and yeah, so we got someone who really didn't qualify for the job. And the board should monitor the CEO's performance at least annually, meaning it could be more frequently. But the board has to monitor the CEO. If the board doesn't monitor the CEO's performance, who will? Everyone else works under the CEO the CEO has the power of termination of almost every employee, maybe every employee. So the CEO has to be monitored by the board. All right, we are up to keyword number 2, economy. Keyword number 2, economy. I will give you about 30 seconds to write that down. And while I'll take a look, I don't see any questions coming through. Please remember, these words have to be written down so you can put them on the evaluation at the end of the morning in order to receive CPE credit. Keyword number 2 is economy. Let us move on. Board should provide proper financial oversight. They should assist in developing the annual budget. Now, this is one of the board's most significant policy decisions, approving the annual budget. But the board may have to be involved in developing the budget. Depends on the sophistication of the staff. If you have a CPA type, doesn't have to be a CPA, but a CPA type person as the CFO, whether you call the person vice president of finance, controller, chief financial officer, if you have someone who's capable and you have program people who are capable of giving the CFO true budgets for their programs or their departments, then the board can take a step back and wait until they receive a draft of the budget. In a very small organization where, let's say, you have a CPA as chair of the finance committee or the audit committee, then that person may actually get involved in helping to develop the annual budget. But the board should not just approve what is presented. It should go first, my opinion, it should go first to a finance committee where they ask a lot of detailed questions of the preparer of the budget. And once the finance committee is satisfied, and that may take 2 meetings because the management people may have to go back and redo some lines on the budget. But once the finance committee approves the budget, then it should go to the full board because that is a board decision to approve the budget. But they can't just approve what's presented. I've maintained with every organization on whose board I've sat. In fact, I without disclosing the name of this organization, one organization up here in Rockland County, I served on the board for 9 years. At my first board meeting, the budget for the following year was presented, and the board was not given copies of the budget. Forget in advance. It wasn't even given copies there in the boardroom. The treasurer just read the budget, and I objected, and I said, this is not the way a budget is to be approved. We should have gotten copies of this budget a week or so ago, give us time to study it and raise questions. So it would happen that they tabled it, and we came back a month later and approved it. But the board should just not approve. They should be ready to ask questions because if you don't understand why a certain line is the amount it is, question it. Why is it so high? Why is it higher than last year? Why is it less than we spent last year? Because remember, the budget sets into motion all sorts of priorities, both programmatic and personnel and other areas. Ensure that proper controls are in place within the financial management. Monitor the budget. Board members, once they approve the budget, then they should be monitoring the budget via periodic, timely financial statements and reports. And if the board meets monthly, every month there should be an updated financial statement, both a P&L statement and a balance sheet and the P&L statement should have comparisons of actual to budget so that it enables board members to raise questions on a timely basis. Board should also monitor cash management. How much cash do we have? Why is cash so low compared to last month or compared to last year at this time? Monitor the performance of the CFO. Now, we will rely on the CEO to assess the performance of the CFO, but the board should ask questions of the CFO not only to learn more about the finances of the organization, but also to assess the CFO's knowledge and performance. The board may not make a recommendation to, the board may not be the oversight agency of the CFO. That's really the CEO's responsibility. But they can't let the CFO just ride. They have to ask questions of the CFO at these monthly meetings when the actual versus budget is presented. Board should ensure adequate resources to the organization. In other words, there should be adequate resources to fulfill the organization. And this does not mean that board members should make large contributions, but they should accept responsibility for leading or at least being involved in the fundraising effort. Even if there's a development department, there's nothing wrong, again, in the board becoming involved in fundraising. In fact, not only is there nothing wrong, it's appropriate. Board members have the ability to influence resource providers. There's nothing wrong with board members contacting resource providers and talking about what the organization is doing to benefit the community. Boards can cultivate interest in the organization among potential resource providers and maintain relationships with resource providers even after the donation. Now, I mentioned before the give-get policy, and I've said 3 times already, I'm not a fan. But a lot of organizations do have a give-get policy. This is where every board member has to give a certain amount a year and, in addition, either give or get an additional amount. As I said, it could create problems in the recruitment of board members, but for some organizations it works, especially for large regional and national organizations. Boards should ensure legal and ethical integrity and maintain accountability. Remember, management's responsible to adhere to legal standards and ethical norms, but the board has the ultimate responsibility for ensuring adherence to legal and ethical requirements. Fraud, embezzlement, or any other breaches of trust have led to increased scrutiny by regulators and watchdog agencies and financial press. And of course, what happens there is that reputation could suffer, and when reputation suffers, as I've mentioned before, it's sometimes very hard to get it back to where it should be. Go beyond what is minimally required to maintain accountability. And I mentioned this before, policies are not sufficient, actions must support policies. Boards can set policies, but if they don't take action to support them, defend them, and enforce them, then the policies are just pieces of paper. There should be a conflict of interest policy which should be established by the board with management's assistance and reviewed annually. All employees and board members should annually affirm adherence to the conflict of interest policy in writing. Every year I have to sign, and every board I've been, almost every board I've been on, I have to sign a conflict of interest policy every year. Also, all employees should sign a conflict of interest policy every year. And that policy, all they're signing is that they've read the policy, they're familiar with the policy, they are adhering to the policy, and they will notify the appropriate person if there's a conflict of interest. Usually, the appropriate person to notify in most organizations is either the chair of the board or the chair of the audit committee. That's generally who it is. Any instances of fraud or other inappropriate action must be dealt with quickly. And of course, we talk about what is the proper punishment. Fraud is very damaging to an organization. Remember, there are 2 types of fraud. There's misappropriation, which is stealing from your employer or from the organization which you're volunteering for. And there's a financial statement, intentional misstatement of financial statements. The proper punishment, it's a judgment call, but I'll give you a classic example. A long-standing bookkeeper, she's been there forever, and she's very competent. But she's been stealing from petty cash, and she's been stealing petty amounts. They finally caught her, and they've determined over the last 5 or 6 years she's stolen several $100s over 5 or 6 years. And she apologized, and she offered to pay it back. What's the proper punishment for this long-standing, dedicated employee? The answer is termination. Because if you don't terminate someone who has perpetrated a fraud on the organization, you are telling that you're giving a message to all the other employees that what this person did is not so terrible, because after all, they paid it back. That's not good. So the proper punishment is sometimes, although it's a punishment, it's really a message to all other staff, employees, and volunteers. Ensure effective organizational planning. The board should actively participate in the overall planning process and assist in implementing and monitoring the plan's goals. Planning is the process of translating mission into objectives and goals so they can be measured and accomplished. And the board's role is to ask good questions of management, expect good answers, and serve as a resource to management of personal and professional expertise. So it goes both ways. The board should be challenging management by asking good questions, and they should expect that their questions will receive proper answers. But at the same time, the board will serve as a resource to management, because if you have the proper board with proper professional and experiential diversity, their expertise will be helpful to management. Recruit and orient new board members and assess board performance. We should articulate the requisites for candidates. We should disclose what the experience, skills, influence, and demographics are that define a balanced board composition, and move toward greater board diversity in all dimensions. I mentioned racially, ethnicity, age, gender, and experience, professional and maybe even personal experience. And the board should assess its own performance. How well is our board meeting its responsibilities? And every 1 to 2 years at a board retreat using a facilitator, there can be a discussion of how the board is meeting its own responsibilities. I've had that. I've been at board meetings where we've done that, and it's great. If you have the right facilitator, it actually goes smoothly. You don't get into fights with people. You can talk about how the board as a whole is meeting its responsibilities, what it should do different and maybe better. And there's also a way through written analyses that are submitted to the facilitator where board members can make constructive suggestions about specific other board members. Assess the performance of individual board members eligible for re-election or reappointment. Do not just reappoint somebody who's been there because their first term is up. They can serve another, let's say 3 years. Let's say the policy is you can serve 2 3-year terms and the first 3 years are up. Don't just reappoint them or reelect them. Assess their performance. Are they valuable to the organization? If not, tell them that they're not going to be reappointed. Not the worst thing. They'll survive. Of course, recruit qualified new board members. I mentioned earlier, this should be an ongoing responsibility, not just at the time of board turnover, not just when people are ready to step off the board, but constantly recruit new board members. And if you have people in reserve that are ready to step on and other people step off, that's great. Also, you can increase the size of the board. Let's say you have 28 people on the board. No one's due to step down for another year, and you just found someone who'd be a great addition. A CPA, we're looking for one. So you increase the size of the board by 1. That's easy. And these can all be the responsibility of a governance committee, and that's what we are doing at this Center for Safety and Change by establishing this governance committee. Enhance the organization's public status, public standing. The board should clearly articulate the organization's mission, accomplishments, and goals to the public and garner support from the community. Board members are always on duty. No matter where you are an ambassador for the organization. You're an advocate. And whether you're with community representatives or government leaders or the media or potential or current funding sources, you are on duty as an ambassador and advocate for the organization, and you should always be speaking on behalf of the organization. Of course, you should know what you should say and what you should not say. You are not the official authorized representative, as far as that would usually be the board chair and or the CEO, but you can always advocate for the organization, talk up the organization, tell people how wonderful the organization is, all the great things that they are accomplishing in the community. That's fine, but don't talk about setting policy. Who should be the organization's official spokesperson? I just said it could be the CEO, it could be the board chair or president. If an organization has an articulate board leader, a really good speaker, well, there are advantages of having this person serving the function. It could be more than one person, but make sure there are no conflicting statements. If the CEO and the board president are both speaking on behalf of the organization, make certain that they're not contradicting each other. The board should determine, monitor, and strengthen the organization's programs and services. This is the fundamental responsibility, mission of the organization. We're mission-driven. Finances and fundraising are secondary to attention to the mission. Now, there are some who will disagree with that statement, so I believe it's true. And I'm an accountant. Without adequate attention paid to mission, the other areas can become irrelevant. In fact, if we don't pay adequate attention to mission, the rest of the organization could fall apart. Support the chief executive and assess his or her performance. It's more than just evaluate. That's important, but we also have to support the chief executive. We have to provide moral and professional support to the CEO in order to further the organization's goals, provide constructive feedback and guidance to the CEO. It's possible that you might meet with the CEO on there might be a committee that meets with the CEO on a regular basis, committee of the board. Develop mutually agreed upon goals and objectives. Make sure that the CEO understands the board's directives, their strategy, and is prepared to carry that out. Provide a formal performance evaluation relative to the goals and objectives and perform that annually. And the board must evaluate the CEO's performance. Remember, the CEO works for the board, not vice versa. The board should support the CEO until the time comes when they can't, and then they terminate the CEO. But the CEO is an employee. The board is ultimately responsible for the organization. Keyword number 3, control. Okay, keyword number 3, control. Please write it down. Keyword number 3, control. Okay, everybody has it. Let's move on. Let's talk about some governing board operations. Governing documents should be available to board members. It aids in their understanding the organization. It aids in transparency. Governing documents mean a certificate of incorporation and bylaws. Review the size, structure, and independence of the board. A board should have at least 5 members, but it could be many more. As I said, the board I'm on now has approximately 30. 2/3 of the members should be independent and the board as a whole should have a diverse background. I would shoot for a lot more than 2/3 as independent, but that's the minimum that's considered appropriate. The minutes of board meetings should contain enough detail to determine the quality and extension of discussion. And all board minutes should, in fact, must be reviewed and approved at a subsequent board meeting. Every meeting, the first thing on the agenda after welcome should be approval of board minutes from the previous meeting. And there's no reason that that cannot be done. Board minutes should be presented and sent to whoever's going to approve the minutes. It should go to, let's say, the board president from the secretary within days after the meeting, while the board president's mind is fresh on what was discussed, so that the board president can say to the secretary, yes, these minutes do adequately express or adequately describe what we discussed at the meeting. Then and only then it should be sent to all board members with sufficient time for board members to read the minutes so that they can come prepared to vote to approve them at the next board meeting. Now, there really are two types of board minutes, and I'm not going to espouse one over the other. There's what we call he said, she said board minutes, which are very extensive, pretty much talks about he said this, she said this, they discussed this, and a decision and what the decision was made. Or there's what's called action minutes. Action minutes, this will disclose the following was discussed and the decision was made as follows. Action minutes, what actions the board took. Now, frankly, I think we should strive to get as close as possible to he said, she said, without literally taping the whole minutes, the whole meeting and then transcribing it onto paper. I don't think we need to do that. Action minutes are great at committee meetings. It's probably not enough at a board meeting. But there are some organizations, especially smaller community-based organizations, that rely on action minutes. But keep in mind, minutes should be maintained theoretically in perpetuity in some binder somewhere. So board members have three fiduciary duties: duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. The duty of care requires board members to exercise diligence and prudence in the oversight of the organization, applying reasonable and sound judgments. They should handle duties with the care that an ordinary prudent person would use under similar circumstances. In other words, duty of care says, I will manage my responsibility to the organization the same as I would manage my responsibility to myself. I have a duty to be careful and apply that in my job as a board member. And don't just attend board meetings, prepare for the board meetings and participate in board meetings. That's the duty of care. Secondly, the duty of loyalty. This requires board members to be loyal in their dealings with the entity and to put the organization's needs above their own, which means they should act in good faith. They should not join a board in order to benefit from that board membership. They should not allow personal interests to prevail over the organization's interests, and obviously they should identify and disclose any conflicts of interest when they arise. And if a vote is going to be taken on an issue and they have a conflict of interest, they should disclose it and recuse themselves. And in fact, state law at times requires them to step out of the room. And then we have the third fiduciary duty, the duty of obedience, which requires board members to be faithful to the organization and its mission. This includes a responsibility to ensure compliance with laws and regulations and conform to the organization's charter and bylaws. So it's both external laws and internal laws that they have to comply with. And it's a responsibility of each board member to make sure that the organization is faithful to these laws, both internal and external, and to the mission. Duty of obedience also forbids acts outside of the scope of corporate powers. Board members should not want an organization to do something that is outside of their legal purview. As far as individual board member responsibilities, we just talked about the board as a whole. The board as a whole. Know the organization's mission, purpose, goals, policies, programs, services, strengths, and needs. Perform board membership duties responsibly. Suggest possible board nominees. Anytime you know someone who you think might fit into the board because the organization needs someone with that person's background, strength, or diversity, suggest it. Board members should serve on committees, whether it's program administrative and or fundraising. At Center for Safety and Change, we have a requirement in the board member's description. Must serve on at least one standing committee and, if possible, one event committee. Serve in leadership positions or undertake special assignments willingly and enthusiastically. The last thing the chair of the board wants to hear if they ask someone to take on a board member to take on a responsibility is no. Counsel the CEO in your area of expertise. For example, I have met with, on Zoom or telephone, with our CEO several times to talk about things such as, well, I'll give you an example. She was under the impression, because she was told this by somebody, that the organization is not permitted to lobby. And I counseled her on the fact that, yes, we may lobby. We're a 501c3. We have ability to lobby, but there are limitations and restrictions. Prepare for and participate in board and committee meetings. Remember, board membership requires homework. You're just not coming to a meeting every month for 2 hours or so. You have to prepare for the meeting, and that requires homework. There will be things that are sent out to board members that should be read prior to the board meeting. Board members should ask timely and substantive questions. That's very important to raise issues that other board members may not have thought of. And then they may say, oh, yeah, that's a good thought. Support the majority decision. You may be in a minority. I'll give you an example. I've told you that I'm not a fan of give-get. When we voted, I voted against establishing that policy, but I now support the policy. That doesn't mean that next time it comes up for a vote in a year or two, I might try to get it voted down, because I think it has negative connotations. But outside the organization, and I'm not talking about today where I'm lecturing, but outside the organization, in the community, I support the decision. Maintain confidentiality. Leaks can damage an organization, its reputation, and I'll repeat, reputation is its most valuable asset. And suggest agenda items when warranted. Don't just wait to get the agenda. Suggest items that you think should be discussed. Serve the organization as a whole and avoid special interest groups or constituency. Avoid asking for special favors. Now, there may be times that because you're a member of the board, you know someone else on the board who can do something that will be helpful to you personally or professionally. That's okay. But avoid asking the board as a whole for a special favor, because that may give them the impression that you joined the board in order to receive favors. Avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest, and of course disclose all potential conflicts of interest. Maintain independence and objectivity. Never accept or offer favors or gifts from anyone who does business with the organization. And if you get such an offer, report it immediately to the board. That would either be the board chair or the audit committee chair. Never accept favors or gifts from anyone who does business with the organization. That's an absolute forbidden thing. Exercise prudence in the control and transfer of funds. Be aware of not properly spending restricted resources. Now, not everybody's an accountant. Not everybody understands the concept of donor restrictions. But it's not a difficult thing to understand that we should not be spending restricted resources in areas that do not meet the donor stipulation. Read and understand the financial statements. Ask questions. Now, I will tell you that I have a problem with the word understand here. I can ask all board members, which I do. We send the financial statements to the board prior to the board meeting, and I ask them to please read them and write down any questions they may have. I can't really tell them you must understand them, because most non-accountants are truly not going to understand the financial statements. But that's my job as chair of the audit committee. I make a report once a year on the audited financial statements and the 990, where I explain them in great detail, the way I would to a governing board when I was a partner in my former firm. I would present the financial statements of the 990 and explain them so they would understand them. So in essence, with the proper person chairing the audit committee, that will be met. Understand and approve the annual budget. There, the word understand is important, because an annual budget is not like a set of financial statements. It's easily understood. You have line items and amounts in each line item. And you should understand what each line item means and how the amounts compare with the prior year and how the amounts compare with the prior year's budget. Review the Form 990, ideally before it is filed, but that's not in the law. There's a question asked on the 990. Did the board approve this 990 before it was filed? And it would be nice to say yes, but sometimes it can't be yes because we have to file it by the due date. The board may not be meeting for a while, but they can approve it after the fact, so long as it's approved by the audit committee, which it is in our case. Provide financial support according to your personal means, even whether there's a give-get policy or not. Every board member should provide financial support to the organization. I don't care if it's $50 a year. There should be something that we should be able to say to potential donors. We have 100% board support on this drive. Assistant fundraising. If you're not comfortable making the ask, just serve on an event committee. You can help plan and run the event, whether it's a dinner dance or a theater benefit or a 5K run or whatever. Bring goodwill and a sense of humor to board deliberations. Don't take yourself so seriously. I mean, you don't want to be known as the frown guy on the board. He's the guy who's always nasty guy, never happy. There should be a sense of humor at board deliberations. It makes it more fun, more enjoyable. Cooperate with other board members. You don't have to be their friends. You're not there to make friends, but you are there to work with other board members. So cooperate with them. Work together to achieve goals that benefit the organization. I mentioned earlier, we'll talk later about term limits and whether they're good or bad. So let's do that. Should board members have term limits? Now, I've served on one board, it was United Way of Rockland County. There was a term limit, 3 3-year terms, and you had to rotate off. The one I'm on now, Center for Safety and Change, it's 2 3-year term limits you have to rotate off. So what are the advantages of having term limits? Well, it forces the board to bring new ideas to the board, because when I leave, they're going to bring on maybe, hopefully, another CPA type person like me who will chair the audit committee, and he or she may bring on new thoughts on what the audit committee should be doing, and that's good. It also creates the opportunity for diversity of board members, because if more people have to rotate off, it gives you the ability to bring on new people and help diversify the board members, not only in professional or personal experience, but racially, ethnicity-wise, age, gender, etc. But there are disadvantages. Loss of highly qualified, knowledgeable, experienced board members. You got someone on the board who's been there for 20 years. In fact, she was a founder of the organization, and she has a history that you don't want to lose. And she's knowledgeable about so many things that go on in the organization. You don't want to lose that. You don't have to. You could, by the way, set up an advisory committee to the board, which would meet with key board members 2 times a year, 3 times a year, whatever, to meet with board members, talk about what's going on and how they could, what information they have that they could provide. But if you have a policy that board members must rotate off after X number of years or X number of terms, then you really should enforce the policy. I know of one organization, they have a policy, 6 years and you must rotate off, but there's one person on the board who was a founding member of the board. She is there for, 40 years on the board. They don't want to lose her, so they're keeping her. And my only thought in talking to the CEO of that organization is, okay, hey, fine, but then you don't have a policy. You have a policy that you're not enforcing, or a policy for which you're making exceptions. Then change your policy. Change to something that meets what you're actually doing, which is the goal is to rotate people off after X number of years. But if the organization believes that a specific person in an unusual case should remain on the board can vote to do that. Okay, and then that's your policy, and that's what you follow. Let's take a look at some key governance needs and the time that's remaining to us in this session. There should be a written code of ethics for board members. that states that what the organization's values are, and is presented to board members during the orientation process. The code should become part of the not-for-profit's culture rather than a stale document that is easily forgotten, and it should be reviewed periodically. So there should be a code of ethics reviewed periodically and adhered to. All right, keyword number 4, alert, A-L-E-R-T, alert. I will give you 30 seconds to write it down, and then we will move on. Once again, keyword number 4, alert. Okay, let's move on. There should be a conflict of interest policy for board members, which requires periodic disclosures and consistent monitoring. Some boards read the policy before every meeting, and some have quarterly or semi-annual reminders. Don't ask me why there's a hyphen between the words or and semi-annual. It's a typo. I'll speak to my proofreader. That's me, by the way. There should be a whistleblower policy. This encourages everyone associated with the organization to come forward without fear of retaliation. Some organizations use a hotline, while others designate a certain person in the organization to receive and respond to complaints, for example, board president or chair of the audit committee, which again is the two most common positions to receive complaints about unethical behavior or anything that requires the whistle to be blown. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act actually requires a whistleblower policy of all not-for-profit organizations. It's also required by the New York State Nonprofit Revitalization Act. Just so you know, if you had a whistleblower policy in effect under SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, when the New York State law was passed several years later, Nonprofit Revitalization Act, it stated that if you have a similar policy, which would come under Sarbanes, then you're okay. There should be a document retention and destruction policy, which should undergo legal review to make sure it complies with state and federal laws and requires regular compliance monitoring. This is also required by SOX and with a similar requirement in the Nonprofit Revitalization Act. And the same comment as I made a few moments ago, you'll be in compliance with New York State law if you're in compliance with SOX. There should be an expense reimbursement policy. Now, you could follow IRS guidelines. They're pretty simple. It requires a documentation and receipts for all purchases over a specific dollar amount. Don't just reimburse someone because they give you a note that they spent X dollars on a certain item. There should be documented and receipts. There should be no payment of personal expenses or family travel from expense accounts. That should never be done. Even if they're going to reimburse the organization, that's not a way to account for these things. And reviewers should be empowered to question any and all expenditures. For example, who should review the CEO's expense reimbursement request? Should it be the CFO? Now, the CEO may review the CFO's expense reimbursement request and approve it or not. But who should review the CEO's expense reimbursement request? In my mind, it should be a board member. It should be treasurer or chair of the audit committee or president or chair of the board. It should not be the CFO because since the CEO is the CFO supervisor or superior, the CFO might be intimidated into approving an invoice that he or she knows should not be approved, while a board member would not be. There should be a gift acceptance policy, and this should be reviewed by legal counsel. For example, potential gifts should be screened to determine whether ethics, financial circumstances, or other interests are compromised by the acceptance of the gift. A best practice for organizations with no investment portfolio is to liquidate gifts of securities immediately to avoid losing a portion of the donation if the value of the securities suddenly drops. But do you want to accept gifts from just anybody? And maybe you might develop a list of persons in the community who you're not going to accept support from for reasons that are unique to the organization. Maybe it's a person whose reputation in the community is very bad, and if they get linked to the organization, that might inure to the detriment of the organization. Also, be careful what you accept, even if it's from the right people. I had a client many, many years ago. I wasn't a partner yet, so I'm probably going back to the mid-'70s. They were a fundraising organization, not a direct human service organization, and they raised back then $250 million a year. That was back in the mid-'70s. They accepted a gift of a parcel of land, and I don't remember if it was Montana or Wyoming, one of those two states. It was a large parcel of land. You know, Montana is just full of land. And they just accepted it, and they figured they'd sell it because they have no use for it. And when they went to sell it, they found out that it was a toxic waste dump site. And it seems nobody knew this except the people who out in Montana. And the people who, the regulators in Montana required this New York City-based nonprofit organization to remove the toxic waste site, the toxic chemicals there, before they would allow it to be sold. And it turned out that the removal of the toxic chemicals cost back then about $1 million. And they were able to sell the land for in excess of $1 million, but not a heck of a lot in excess of $1 million. So, I mean, the lesson I learned then is that just don't accept any non-cash gift. Make sure you know what you're accepting. There should be a process that allows the board to review the Form 990 before it is filed. I've discussed that before. It's not always practical, but that should be the goal. There should be a board compensation policy. Nonprofit board members should not be excessively compensated, but that leads to the question, should nonprofit board members be compensated ever? Now, we're not talking about expense reimbursement. If a board member spends money legitimately, he or she should be reimbursed. But should nonprofit board members be compensated for their time? Most people say, no, that's terrible. You shouldn't do that. Well, there is nothing in the law in New York State. There's nothing in the Internal Revenue Code that prohibits it. So it's really a judgment call. Some private foundations compensate their board members. Most 501c3 public charities do not. There should be an oversight of independent review of financial statements. The best practice calls for an independent audit committee that monitors financial practices and is involved in auditor selection. And recruiting board members with financial expertise is critical to assist this process. So if you want a good audit committee, you need people, at least one person similar to me, in other words, an accountant with some basic knowledge of nonprofit financial management, including budgeting and internal controls, and gap and gas knowledge. And there are a number of people like that around. They're out there. There should be procedures for selecting and monitoring grant recipients. Enormous jeopardize the organization's exemption, which we're going to talk about at the end of the morning today. There should be endowment, investment, and spending policies. Make sure that investment and spending of funds are done responsibly. Again, these are all things that the governing board needs to be involved in. There should be a fundraising policy, although this is seen in practice less frequently. A written policy that is monitored for compliance and reviewed with management annually is important for any organization with an active fundraising campaign. The fundraising policy should discuss compliance with laws, make sure that a fundraising policy does not step out of bounds of the law. It shouldn't be overly aggressive because that could result in reputation damage. But most important, the fundraising must be truthful. It is not a good idea to tell lies or stretch the truth when making an ask. And the policy should so state. So I mentioned earlier the 33 principles. There's something called the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, which is COSO. They prescribe 5 principles governing an audit committee's actions. The audit committee should demonstrate commitment to integrity and ethical values. We're kind of the oversight committee for integrity and ethical values. We should exercise oversight responsibility, establish structure, authority, and responsibility, demonstrate commitment to competence, which means getting the right people on the committee, and establish accountability, which is the main thrust of the audit committee. Sarbanes-Oxley requires the audit committees of publicly held companies to be composed solely of independent members. An independent audit committee is more effective when members possess the appropriate skill set. For example, the chair should possess financial expertise, knowledge of GAAP, GAS, internal controls, risk management. Other members of the committee should have some level of financial acumen and just an understanding of financial statements. Keyword number 5, fraud. Give you a few minutes on this one, a few minutes, 30 seconds on this one. Let's see if there are any questions. I don't see any. Keyword number 5, fraud. Okay, let us move on through the remainder of this session. In New York State, the Nonprofit Revitalization Act requires every charitable corporation and charitable trust that is registered to solicit contributions and required to file an audit report to designate an audit committee of the board. You must have an audit committee if you're subject to audit and you have to file a report with the Charities Bureau. The audit committee must consist solely of independent directors or trustees. It is my belief that all not-for-profit organizations, even if not required by law to have one, should establish an audit committee. So I was president of my synagogue for a few years, and we underwent an audit every year of our financial statements, and we established an audit committee. We didn't have to have one because we didn't file with New York State. We were a charity, not charity, we were a religious organization, therefore did not have to file, but we had an audit committee. Generally, the audit committee oversees the accounting and financial reporting processes and the audit. It retains the auditor. It's the primary liaison between management and the auditor. And it reviews the results of the audit with the auditor. Also, what's not on there is the audit committee could make the annual report to the board where they explain the financial statements and the auditor's report and the Form 990 and the letter of comments, the AUC 265 letter, if the auditor doesn't do it. In addition, the audit committee can do the following, because they are receiving increasing attention from audit committees. You can just quickly glance down at them. I'm not going to read this page, but you can see that these are areas that, in addition to just overseeing the audit, reviewing the audit results with the auditor, and retaining the auditor each year, these are areas that the audit committee could get themselves involved in. And this comes from a list from the Attorney General's office. Audit committee should pay attention to donor risks, such as reliance on a small group of donors, including board members, lack of donor retention and growth, lack of clarity around donor intent, undue influence of donors, or accepting gifts not aligned with our program, accepting gifts that damage the entity's reputation, or from tainted donors. improper use of the entity's name or logo by fundraisers, turnover in the development of leadership and staff, leading to loss of donor connectivity, and valuation of non-cash gifts. That's a very common area of, let's just say, misstatement, whether due to error or fraud. There is an AICPA Audit Committee Toolkit. It's a great publication. I recommend it highly to any audit committee that an organization has. It's developed specifically for not-for-profit organizations. It provides all of the most common forms and tools specially tailored for nonprofits, and it has an accompanying CD-ROM. So some final thoughts. Nonprofit organizations need to educate the board and staff about good governance. They can use the AICPA Audit Committee Toolkit, the nonprofit kit. Adopt or formalize policies and procedures related to good governance. Make sure that board members understand their duties and obligations and the risks of being board members. That they understand the importance of the 990 and questions regarding the governing body and management. Auditors need to educate their clients and themselves about good governance. They should encourage clients to adopt what they consider to be best practices. Auditors should communicate with the board, explain the audit report, the financial statements, the notes, the Form 990, the client representation letter, and both the AUC 260 and 265 communications. Insist that the board work with you, the auditor. The board is the ones who retain the auditor, not management, and the board should work with you. And auditing not-for-profit organizations, understand, involves risks. So read the AICPA Audit Risk Alert annually, and we're going to do that after a 10-minute break. So that's it. It is now, let's see, there were no questions. It is now 12 minutes after 10, so we will reconvene in 10 minutes at 22 minutes after 10, and we'll start in with the Nonprofit Audit Risk Alert. See you guys in 10 minutes. All right, it's 10:22. Let's get started on the Nonprofit Audit Risk Alert for 2021, which was just published by the AICPA within the last several weeks. And I was able to put together a session that we'll now go through today. I assume I can be heard. Will someone confirm that, please?
Confirmed.
Okay, thank you. Here we go.
Loud and clear.
So what is the Audit Risk Alert? The Audit Risk Alert provides auditors of not-for-profit entities with an overview of recent economic, industry, technical, regulatory, and professional developments that may affect the audits and other engagements that they perform. It can also be used by management to address areas of audit concern. I used to, when I was in practice, tell my clients, CFOs, and sometimes even the CEO, to get the AICPA Nonprofit Audit Risk Alert and read it, because it'll give them an understanding of what it is that I need to know. So the areas that I'm concerned with, so that they understand when I start asking them questions, they'll at least have a general understanding of why I'm asking these questions. Understand that the Audit Risk Alert is an other auditing publication and is not authoritative. It doesn't set generally accepted auditing standards, even though it's published by the AICPA. However, it will help the auditor understand and apply generally accepted auditing standards. The contents of the Audit Risk Alert is the same every year. We're going to concentrate in this session on how this alert helps you, the economic and industry developments, legislative and regulatory developments. At the end of this session, we'll spend a few minutes on audit, attestations, and accounting issues and developments. The Audit Risk Alert helps us plan and perform audits of not-for-profit entities. It provides us with information that will assist us in achieving a more robust understanding of the business, economic, and regulatory environments in which our clients operate. It helps nonprofits, it helps identify the significant risks that may result in material misstatement of financial statements. The misstatement of financial statements, they say, happens because of error or fraud, which is true. But there are risks that will play a part or a role in creating these material misstatements of financial statements. The Risk Alert also delivers information about emerging practice issues and current accounting, auditing, and regulatory developments. The auditor should understand the meaning of audit risk and the interaction of audit risk with the objective of obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Now, if we were in an in-person live presentation, I would now stop and say, who here understands what the definition of audit risk is? And I'd wait about 10 seconds, and usually nobody would raise their hand, and I would say, well, can anybody define audit risk? And maybe one hand would go up, but they really wouldn't know what audit risk is, unless they remember from the previous year's seminar on the Audit Risk Alert from last year. Well, audit risk is the risk of rendering an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, when in fact, the opinion should have been modified. And if you remember from yesterday, modified audit opinion the three of them are qualified opinion, adverse opinion, disclaimer of opinion. That's audit risk, the risk of rendering or issuing an unmodified when it should have been a modified opinion. By the way, a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, the opposite is not audit risk. The risk of giving a modified opinion when it should have really been unmodified is not audit risk, that's client loss risk. That's, again, tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of accounting humor. So auditors obtain audit evidence that will enable them to draw reasonable conclusions on which to base their opinion by performing audit procedures. Now, if you look at these bullets, these are all the audit procedures we perform by category. When we're doing an audit, we're either doing risk assessment procedures or further audit procedures. And within further audit procedures, there are tests of controls, which might be required by generally accepted auditing standards, or the auditor could choose to do so. What times are not, we don't test controls, we do a substantive audit. Further audit procedures include substantive procedures, and those include tests of details and substantive analytical procedures. So if you look at it, you've got risk assessment, test of controls, test of details, and substantive analytical procedures. That's it. Anything you do in an audit falls into one of those four categories. And those are the audit procedures we do to obtain evidence that will support our opinion. Keyword number 6, workforce. Workforce. Keyword number 6. Please write it down. Give you a few more seconds to write down keyword number 6, workforce. The auditor should develop an audit plan that includes the nature and extent of planned risk assessment procedures. Risk assessment procedures, you might know, are audit procedures performed to obtain an understanding of the entity and its environment, including the entity's internal control, so as to identify and assess the risks of material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error, at both the financial statement level and the relevant assertion levels. We don't have time to go into the great detail of what that means. Please understand that risk assessment procedures are not required under generally accepted auditing standards. They are described as shoulds. The auditor should perform a risk assessment at the during every audit of financial statements, and should is defined in standards as presumptively mandatory, which is different than being required. However, when I was the quality controls partner in my firm, my number one rule was that must means must and should means must, because I don't want to get involved in trying to defend why I didn't do something I should do. As part of obtaining the required understanding of the entity and its environment, the auditor should obtain an understanding of the industry, regulatory, and other external factors relevant to the entity, and the audit risk alert assists the auditor in that risk assessment process and expands the auditor's understanding of other important considerations relevant to the audit. So first, we'll take a brief look at some economic and industry developments. The current economy. When planning and performing an auditor should gain should understand both the general and specific economic conditions facing the industry in which the client operates. That means both local and national economic activities relating to factors such as interest rates, availability of credit, consumer confidence, overall economic expansion or contraction, inflation, real estate values, labor market conditions. All of these are likely to affect an entity's business and therefore its financial statements. So we have to kind of gain an understanding of what's going on in the economy. And as I said, both the national economy and the local economy, because if you're looking at things like real estate values, it's totally different in Manhattan than it is in Arizona. So you can't just look at national statistics. So here we go with COVID-19. And the section is entitled The State of Not-for-Profits. The full effects of the COVID-19 pandemic are yet to be seen. Operating during this crisis has been and continues to be challenging for many not-for-profits. There is an increased demand for services. At the same time, we've experienced loss of staff, staff working remotely. There have been changes in internal controls, and there have been changes in fundraising plans, with many organizations taking their events online, which results in a greatly reduced fundraising event with significantly fewer dollars being raised. The US government took unprecedented action to provide funding to individuals, businesses, and not-for-profits. So nonprofits need to figure out the funding. What's available to them? What compliance requirements do they have to meet? And how to account for some of these. We talked about these yesterday. We even talked about some accounting issues with regard to PPP and ERC. Although 2021 began with some optimism, uncertainty remains. Now remember, this audit risk alert, even though it was published just several weeks ago, was being written earlier this year. So at that point, yeah, we had some optimism, but we knew there was some uncertainty. Nobody, I don't think, anticipated at that time that by the summer we would be back to where we are now. Virtual seminars, wearing masks, etc. Auditors should continue to monitor the impacts of economic trends, local, regional, and national, on audit risk throughout the year as more information becomes available. A lot of businesses were planning to open by Labor Day. Now, maybe not so much. Nonprofits should assess the effects of the pandemic on the following major areas: technology, resources, meaning funding, program services, workforce, and internal control, because all of these are being impacted significantly by the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's start with technology. Flexible and remote working arrangements became essential to continued operations for many nonprofits during the pandemic. But remote work, you realize, presents unique challenges, particularly for information security controls, because remote work environments do not usually have the same safeguards as office environments. When people and computers leave the office and work remotely, new risks arise for the organization and additional security policies become necessary. Now, keep in mind, we are talking in this session about COVID-19's impact on nonprofits, not on the audit firm. But there are a lot of analogies when we talk about it, and you'll see some as we go through this, and we're going to mention some audit issues also. Information security and remote working best practices that nonprofits should consider include establishing and communicating remote work security policies. For example, avoid public wireless network. And when you use public personal devices to store or process work information. Addressing authorization and authentication of information. If you're getting things virtually, where is it coming from? Is it authorized? Is it authentic? Ensuring employees are aware of current phishing and malware campaigns, because they are increasing significantly, because more and more business people, including nonprofit people, including auditors, are doing things online, virtually. And that leads to concerns about securing communication travel channels, providing vigilant technology support, and if necessary, encrypting sensitive data. Many sources of revenue have been affected by the pandemic. Special events have been canceled. I know at Center for Safety and Change, we canceled last year's big dinner dance that we have every year. That is our major fundraiser. We raised something in the area of $100,000+, and in a $5 million budget, that's a big number. Schools have been closed. That has created problems for students, for teachers, for parents, and for nonprofits. Uncollectible pledges, a decline in membership and membership organizations, and a decline and changes in government funding. Nonprofits are faced with how to continue to provide services with fewer resources. Nonprofits must consider the impact of the reduction in resources on the financial viability of the organization, both in the short term, going concern issues, are they actually going to make it? Are they going to stay in business? And also long-term implications. Will they have to drop certain programs to stay in business? Nonprofits with going concern issues have had to immediately assess their current situation and create financial plans going forward, which include things such as taking strategic cost-saving measures, increasing spending from endowments, using board-designated funds, and asking donors to reclassify restricted contributions for general operations. These are all areas that many nonprofits have done, and they don't want to do it. That first one, taking strategic cost-saving measures, might be cutting back on services. That's not what they want to do. That's not what they're in business to do. Nonprofits that provide direct services, for example, health and human service organizations, have seen increased demand for those services because of the pandemic. However, their ability to provide those services has been hampered due to the impact of COVID-19. There's been a reduction in funding. There's staff who are out sick, quarantined, or working remotely, and an inability to obtain personal protective equipment in a timely manner. That goes back to the beginning of the pandemic. Many nonprofits had to close certain programs because it was impractical or impossible to provide the services. At Center for Safety and Change, here in Rockland County, we have a hotline for domestic abuse to be reported. And the increase in the demand for that program when the pandemic started was 80%. Our demand for services went up by 80%. And we had staff who were out sick and quarantined, and we couldn't turn people away because they need the service. Now, why was that? It's very simple. For the most part, women were stuck at home with their abuser. So, of course, demand for service went up 80%. the need for our sheltered, we have a home for battered or abused spouses, predominantly women, but there are times there are men in there also. It's in a secret location. Nobody knows where. I know where it is, but the public doesn't know where it is for obvious reasons. And we had to close it because of COVID. We actually had to close it. Yet people were calling off, all the time, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. Keyword number 7, sponsorship. Sponsorship. Keyword number 7. Give you several seconds to write it down. Once again, keyword number 7, sponsorship. Let's move on. Many nonprofits provide services and they tend to be labor intensive. That payroll tends to be 2/3 to 3/4 of our total expenses. At the beginning of the pandemic, many nonprofits were not set up for remote work and had difficulty transitioning. Flexibility and a focus on security and communication were critical, as well as the health, safety, and well-being of staff. The challenges included retaining staff, recruiting staff, because there were budget cuts that were impacting on compensation, benefits, and staffing plans. And for nonprofits that are actually hiring, whether in the past year or currently, recruitment and onboarding processes have had to be conducted remotely. Remember, we talked about recruitment and onboarding in the last session, but doing it remotely makes it doubly difficult. Internal control is a big area of change. Remote work environments have brought changes to internal control systems, increasing risk in those areas. Many nonprofits have had to reevaluate existing controls for unintended gaps and have needed to design and implement new or mitigating controls because of remote work patterns. Updates to existing policies and creation of new policies have been needed to accommodate adjustments in roles and responsibilities, to accommodate new funding sources, changes in information technology, and so on. The challenge of maintaining an appropriate segregation of duties, which is the cornerstone of internal control, was magnified by the pandemic environment. The virtual work environment has necessitated changes in processes and duties. Management needs to consider or reconsider who holds physical custody of assets, who is responsible for record keeping for assets, who can authorize and approve transactions. And management needs to ensure that these functions remain separate. Even though we have people working differently than they have in the past, virtually, off-site, they still need to make sure that these functions remain separate. Thorough explanations and supporting documentation for management estimates, including assumptions and methodologies applied, will be more important given the heightened risk in areas such as asset impairment, debt covenants, and assessments of an entity's ability to continue as a going concern. Detailed record keeping also will be necessary for any COVID-19 related funding received and costs incurred. Data management is a risk. Data is arguably an organization's most important asset. Now notice I've been saying in the last session, reputation was its most valuable asset. There's a little difference there. But data is arguably the most important asset for continuity. Organizations must maintain the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical, sensitive, and proprietary data. When data is housed solely on an internal network, controls to protect the data are relatively simple and manageable. Generally, organizations know where the data is, how to access the data, and who may access the data. But with the move to more remote work, managing data becomes more complex, more complicated. Staff members may, without malicious intent, implement applications to increase productivity or to fill a need that they are not getting from their IT department. So they're going to implement their own applications. And if organizations do not know what technology staff are implementing it, they can't secure it. The staff member could be unknowingly exposing organization data to outsiders. And that takes us to physical device management. When systems are connected to an organization's network, it is easier for the IT department to apply controls and investigate and resolve discrepancies. When devices leave the managed network, implementing and monitoring controls may be more difficult. Organization-owned devices are usually equipped to meet baseline security standards. However, personal devices may be unsecured, may not have anti-malware protection, may not be updated, and may not be encrypted. The risk of loss of the confidentiality and integrity of data grows if devices are shared with other members of the staff member's household. For example, children attending school virtually or using the devices for recreational purposes. If someone is using their home computer during the day for work, and then at night the kids go on it to play games, we're risking the integrity and the confidentiality of that data. The use of public, wireless, or home networks by staff members to access organization resources further increases the risk. People may decide, okay, I'll put on a mask, I'll go down to the local Starbucks with my laptop, I'll log in and I'll get some work done, but I can sit and drink coffee. We'll talk now about remote work risks, the risk of misstatement of the financial statements, which is what an audit is supposed to detect. If unmanaged, these risks could significantly affect not only the general security of the organization and its data, but also its financial statements. If an organization does not know where its data is or fails to secure the data, that data may be vulnerable to exploitation and compromise due to malware, ransomware, or other forms of corruption or loss. And all of these risks tie back to the financial statements. If the data is unrecoverable and cannot be recreated, information presented on the financial statements may be inaccurate or incomplete. So how can we meet this challenge? Organizations should measure their risk by defining who is working remotely and how and why they are accessing and storing data via applications, hardware, and other technology. So management has to get involved here. And maybe the board, we talked about that in the last session. Once this assessment is completed, controls can be monitored and enforced. When enforcement and centralization are not possible, enhanced acceptable use policies and increased training and awareness may be necessary to ensure that end users understand their role in securing the organization's data. Organizations should plan for the inevitable. There will be problems. Organizations should ensure that their incident management policies and procedures support timely identification, containment, and resolution when remote data applications or systems are compromised. And it will happen. It's inevitable. With respect to financial statement audits, organizational shifts to remote working environments may prompt audit teams to consider remote risks when evaluating the technology controls over financial reporting. And that may require additional testing. Keyword number 8, remote. Remote. Keyword number 8. Give you a few seconds to write it down. Remote. Okay, let's move on. Now we'll talk a little bit about risks and uncertainties arising from the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has already had sweeping effects on nonprofits, but much uncertainty remains. And again, this audit risk alert was written months ago. It was published several weeks ago, but it was written months ago. Now, I'd say there's even a greater amount of uncertainty. Are our organizations going to be able to reopen their buildings the way they had planned, or their office sites? For many organizations, there may be future risks and uncertainties that are relevant to GAAP-based financial statement users. Management will need to determine whether the COVID-19 pandemic has created disclosable circumstances that exist as of the date the financial statements are issued, are available to be issued, and whether they are expected to continue into the future. There may be certain financial statement disclosures that they're going to need to make because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Nonprofits and their auditors will need to consider how these future risks and uncertainties might affect the nonprofit's GAAP-based financial statements and the accompanying independent auditor's report. All right, let's turn our attention to some other areas which, although not directly impacted by COVID-19, it's still gonna be affected to some degree. And the first thing is ransomware. Ransomware is malicious software that blocks access to a system or data until a sum of money is paid. And there have been a couple of recent incidents of ransomware which have hit the newspapers and the daily news and the newscasts. Cyber attackers have become more numerous, more persistent, and cunning enough to make incident prevention alone an inadequate strategy. It used to be we'd have a strategy to prevent these incidents from happening. That's now no longer sufficient. Most security experts agree that it's no longer a question of whether an attack will occur and succeed, but when. Organizations can take steps to minimize the effects of an attack. Cyber resilience is a relatively new concept that draws together practices related to security, disaster recovery, business continuity, and incident response into a comprehensive readiness and response strategy aimed at minimizing the damage when an incident occurs. Organizations should proactively manage the risk because waiting until a ransomware event occurs can be catastrophic. Educating management on the risk could help get appropriate resources allocated to help the organization prepare. So I think the lesson we're going to take from this concept is ransomware is happening, and it's probably just a matter of time until maybe your organization is a victim of ransomware. So you need to have this cyber resilience in place where you combine not only preventive techniques, but disaster recovery and business continuity and incident response techniques into a comprehensive plan. Fiscal sponsorships. This is interesting. With many nonprofits and programs in distress as a result of the pandemic, the important needs they serve are at risk. Now, we talked about this right up front in this session. Increased demand, but reduced resources, reduced funding, staff that are out sick, staff that are working remotely, all trying to serve an increase in demand. Excuse me. Fiscal sponsorship is one option for saving programs when the nonprofits that operating them cannot be saved. A fiscal sponsorship is an arrangement between a not-for-profit with 501c3 tax-exempt status, and they are the sponsor nonprofit, and another party without tax-exempt status. Often the other party is an organization, group, or individual that wants to conduct a charitable project or activity, because another organization that was doing it has closed their doors or is no longer capable of conducting that activity. The fiscal sponsorship should conform to IRS criteria, and there are 4 things that the IRS says should happen. Contributions are given to a 501c3 organization, that's the sponsor not-for-profit, that accepts responsibility for the funds for a project or activity that does not have tax-exempt status. The sponsor not-for-profit uses the funds for a project or activity that furthers the sponsor NFP's tax-exempt purpose. The sponsor NFP retains discretion and control of the funds. That is, the sponsor NFP has variance power over the funds, and the sponsor NFP maintains adequate records to substantiate the use of the funds for tax-exempt purposes. Those are the IRS criteria for fiscal sponsorships. The sponsor nonprofit accounts for the sponsored project or activity as one of its own activities. So, the assets and liabilities of the sponsored project or activity are reported on the sponsor NFP's balance sheet. The contributions and other revenues and expenses are reported on the sponsor not-for-profit statement of activities, and usually the contributions received for the sponsored project or activity are donor restricted. So that's the accounting for that by the sponsor NFP. Now understand that a fiscal sponsorship arrangement is different from a fiscal agency arrangement, in which a nonprofit serving as agent receives and disperses funds on behalf of another party's project or activity. In that kind of an arrangement, the fiscal agency arrangement, the nonprofit serving as agent has no variance power over how the funds are dispersed. Contributions are tax deductible only if the other party is a tax-exempt organization. The nonprofit serving as agent records the assets received on its balance sheet with an offsetting agency liability. And the nonprofit serving as agent does not record any revenues or expenses for the activity, except for any fees received for providing the service. So the takeaway on this is that there are 2 different types of arrangements. They could both have the same objective, running programs for a nonprofit which is not capable of doing it any longer or has gone out of business. One is a fiscal sponsorship arrangement, the other is a fiscal agency arrangement, and they are very different in how they approach the situation. All right, let's turn our attention to legislative and regulatory developments. And this year, there wasn't much going on. In the past, there was much more in this section, but let's just talk about a few things that I wanted to talk about. Now, we discussed yesterday how to account for the PPP loan, and what it could be accounted for as debt under 470, or can accounted for as a conditional contribution under 958-605. But this slide talks about PPP loan forgiveness and Form 990. And according to the instructions for Form 990 Schedule A, updated on December 10th, 2020, so about 8 months ago, organizations may report forgiven PPP loan amounts on line 1, that would be of Schedule A, as contributions from a governmental unit in the tax year when the amounts are forgiven. Therefore, this should not cause an otherwise qualifying public charity to fail to meet the public support tests. So that's helpful. And now we turn our attention to audit and attestation issues and developments. And we'll talk about auditing in a COVID-19 environment, performing effective remote audits. Because from the auditor's perspective, this is a big issue. As the COVID-19 pandemic hit the US, the new way of conducting fieldwork became an immediate necessity. Firms had to quickly pivot and adjust standard operating procedures to ensure that audit quality was maintained. Performing virtual and remote audits may extend into the foreseeable future. And audit procedures should be designed to uphold audit quality and adhere to audit standards. Now, that third bullet was very prescient, because again, that was probably written many months ago when we thought we were coming out of the pandemic, and we probably will be able to get back to doing audits live and in person. Well, it's now extending into the foreseeable future. I don't see, with where we're going right now as a country, this will probably take us through the December 31, 2021 audit season. We'll probably be working, if not totally, then predominantly virtually and remote. Keyword number 9, guidance. Number 9, guidance. Give you 30 seconds to write that down. Once again, keyword number 9, guidance. All right, let's move on. We're going to need to use all the available technology that we have. Turning computer cameras on during all virtual meetings allows auditors to read body language and gauge nonverbal clues. So what we're saying there is probably better doing meetings with clients, even for routine audit procedures, on your computer using your camera than over the phone, because you'll be able to at least get a handle on their body language. Making it convenient for clients to scan and upload documents to the audit firm's secure portal can be beneficial in compiling audit evidence. I know that our auditors at Center for Safety and Change, we're still doing the December 31, 2020 year-end audit. Now, that was partially because of the pandemic, partially because of turnover of the CFO. We hired when the CFO was let go, we hired an accounting firm to function as our CFO, and they had to get up to date with our processes and procedures. So that took some time. But they do have, the auditors have set up a portal that our accounting staff can upload documents to their portal so that the audit staff can look at the documents quickly and get back to them with any questions. Using screen sharing and video conferencing to replicate certain work environments and gain comfort about documentation legitimacy. For example, asking a client to hold up a specific piece of supporting documentation so that it can be seen and reviewed. That is a good idea. In addition, you can also have them scan it and email it to you. Keep lines of communication open. Ongoing communication with our clients is critical. It's really important because normally, think about it, when we're doing a regular audit where we're on site with the client, the communication is easy, it's natural, it's ongoing. Now it's not as easy. So we have to build some sort of client communication into the audit plan. We have to redesign how we communicate with our clients. Team-based chat software or private chat rooms segregated by client and engagement team can help to simulate an advantageous work environment. It's not easily accomplished, but it could work. Client staff may also be working remotely, so they're not going to be in their offices no more than you're in your offices. So it'll be necessary to build in more time for client staff to scan and organize document selections and deliver them to the audit team, whether it's through email or through a portal or however they design this. But client staff's going to have to do this. They're going to have to scan documents. Monitor cybersecurity. There's an increased reliance on technology, which increases the risk of hackers obtaining private information. Kind of alluded to that several minutes ago. Auditors should be vigilant when receiving data or email attachments. Audit firms should evaluate cybersecurity policies and procedures. It's incumbent on audit firms to make sure that they have appropriate security policies and procedures in place. Auditing standards require auditors to obtain an understanding of internal controls relevant to the audit. As nonprofits have adjusted operations and employees are substantially working remotely, new systems, controls, and documentation procedures have come into play. Auditors should look at what controls are new due to the pandemic and client staff working remotely. And auditors should consider which controls are no longer functioning properly or at all in the current pandemic virtual work environment. Understanding and evaluating internal controls without physically being on site will require a new way of thinking. Most of a nonprofit's employees may continue to work remotely, or they may have a hybrid system of both on-site and remote work. Video conferences with key NFP employees and audit team members likely will be needed to discuss the design of controls, both old and new. And testing the implementation of controls could still be accomplished in a remote environment via scanning and uploading or screen sharing. So there are ways to get around some of these inconveniences, but these are going to take some critical thinking and reinterpretation of how we're going to interface and communicate with clients and obtain the data that we need to see and the documentation that we need to see. Observing nonprofit employees applying controls might not be possible in the current environment of off-site working. Auditors may need to brainstorm and collaborate with the clients to determine how to obtain sufficient evidence about the design and implementation of controls relevant to the audit. Auditors will also need to assess what new fraud risks may result from the pandemic. Consider the pressure element of the fraud triangle. For example, are employees likely to feel entitled to the nonprofit's assets due to pay cuts? Or were furloughed employees disgruntled enough to take actions detrimental to the organization? So these are new fraud risks that result from the pandemic. Do auditors need to assess these? I would say that they do. Some auditors may decide to perform eligibility tests related to a client's PPP loans based on their risk assessment. The method that the nonprofit applies to account for a PPP loan may factor into an auditor's testing procedures. For example, use of the debt model may reduce the need for extensive eligibility testing because the liability would not be derecognized until it is legally released. However, under the contribution model, the conditional contribution model, a nonprofit might recognize full or partial forgiveness at the balance sheet date prior to receiving formal forgiveness from the Small Business Administration. They might not, but it depends on their policy. Auditors that test forgiveness eligibility might conduct procedures such as recalculating the amount of forgiveness recognized, verifying that the expenditures were allowable and in compliance with SBA requirements, and reviewing the forgiveness application for completeness and vouching it to related support for accuracy and cutoff. We should be, especially if it's material, be auditing the forgiveness process for the PPP loans. As far as asset impairment, given the duration, severity, and economic impact of the pandemic, it is likely that extra care will be needed with respect to impairment assessments. For example, the COVID-19 environment could affect collectability and payment terms for receivables. Auditors will need to apply professional skepticism when evaluating forecasts, underlying assumptions, and areas where significant judgment was applied. And yes, COVID-19 has a direct line to going concern. The COVID-19 pandemic may result in a greater number of nonprofits experiencing operational deterioration and uncertain financial conditions. These conditions and events in the aggregate could raise substantial doubt about the nonprofit's ability to continue as a going concern for a reasonable period of time. Auditors must keep the accounting and auditing requirements regarding going concern in mind. Now, we talked about the new SASs yesterday, 134 to 140. There's no reason to go through them again at this point. Just keep in mind that they all become effective for December 31, 2021 year-end audits. As far as accounting issues and developments, adoption of new accounting guidance. We talked about a lot of new accounting guidance yesterday. I mean, RevRec, grants and contracts, leases, gifts in kind, credit losses, collections, and a handful of others. Goodwill. Adoption of new accounting guidance and the related implementation of new requirements increase the risk of material misstatement. Significant accounting changes are areas for increased auditor focus. The key accounting standards updates becoming effective for nonprofits this year and potential auditing considerations with respect to the implementation are discussed in the accounting issues and development section of the audit risk alert. To repeat an earlier slide, this was right up at the beginning of this session. As part of obtaining the required understanding of the entity and its environment, the auditor should obtain an understanding of the economic, industry, legislative, regulatory, and other external factors relevant to the entity. The alert that we've just discussed will assist the auditor in the risk assessment process. In this session, we have reviewed some of these factors. During an audit and carrying out this process, we may identify significant risks of material misstatement of the financial statements. Some possible responses to the identification of significant risks of material misstatement include increasing the extent of audit procedures, do more, performing procedures closer to year end when we do them, and modifying audit procedures to obtain more persuasive evidence, do different. Sometimes these are called, if you go back into your college textbooks, nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures. And that's what these are. What we do, when we do it, and how much we do. Auditors should remain alert to economic, industry, legislative, and regulatory developments, as well as auditing and accounting issues. An auditor should consider changes in the environment throughout the audit and potentially modify audit procedures to ensure that risks are adequately addressed. Keyword number 10, peer, as in peer review. Keyword number 10, peer, P-E-E-R. Give you a few more seconds to write this one down. Okay, let's move on. I will tell you that the audit risk alert that we just covered, I did not cover everything in the audit risk alert. It'd be much too extensive to cover everything. I covered what I thought were the relevant, pertinent, important areas, but you should still read the full audit risk alert. It's only 70 some odd pages. to refresh yourself of what I just discussed, and also to look at some other areas that I did not cover. So let's now turn to the last topic of the morning, and the last topic of this two-morning CPE workshop: tax-exempt status, jeopardizing activities. There are some things that a 501c3 organization can do to some extent, or are not allowed to do, because doing any of them or extensively doing them could jeopardize the tax-exempt status. And here are the four areas we're going to cover in this session. Section 501c3 organizations may not be used for the private benefit of any individual, nor may their earnings inure to the benefit of insiders. 501c3 organizations may only engage in legislative activities, i.e. lobbying, to a limited extent. Section 501c3 organizations are forbidden to engage in political activities. And a Section 501c3 organization will lose its exempt status if it operates for the primary purpose of carrying on an unrelated trade or business. So those are the four areas we're going to be looking at. Let's start with private benefit. An organization must serve a public interest to qualify for exemption under Section 501c3. If the organization serves both a public and private interests, the private benefit must be incidental to the public benefit. And from private benefit, we move into inurement. Some people call it private inurement, but the technical term is inurement. And it simply states, no part of a Section 501c3 organization's net earnings may inure to the benefit of a private individual. Inurement refers to benefits conferred on insiders, such as officers, directors, or key employees. Examples of prohibited inurement include unreasonable compensation and the transfer of real or personal property for less than fair market value. And the prohibition on inurement is absolute. Any amount of inurement is grounds for loss of tax-exempt status. I'm going to repeat that. The prohibition on inurement is absolute. Now, prohibited inurement does not include reasonable payments for services rendered or payments made for the fair market value of property acquired. That's fine. But inurement would include unreasonably high payments for services rendered or payments made above the fair market value to acquire property. And that leads us into a discussion of what's called excess benefit transactions. An excess benefit transaction is any transaction between a 501c3 or a C4 organization and a disqualified person in which the economic benefit is greater than the value of the consideration provided for the benefit, for example, unreasonable compensation for services or a non-fair market value transaction. A disqualified person is any person at any time during the 5-year period ending on the date of the transaction. So it's a 5-year look back from the date of the transaction, in a position to exercise substantial influence over the affairs of the organization. So that would include officers, directors, trustees, key employees, substantial donors. They could exercise substantial influence over the affairs of the organization. So they would all qualify as disqualified persons. Now, in excess, remember that inurement is absolute. And the problem with that is that if an employee, a key employee, is compensated, let's say, in an unreasonable fashion, they get too much compensation, and the IRS challenges it, theoretically, the only sanction the IRS had at its ready was revocation of exemption. And the IRS did not want to have that as the sole remedy. So they went into this, the Congress passed the excess benefit transactions, which really were called the intermediate sanction regulations. Actually, the law was passed by Congress, but the regulations were passed by the IRS, were written by the IRS. People were calling these the intermediate sanctioned regulations because the IRS now has the ability with these regulations, if they feel that someone has been unreasonably compensated, they don't have to revoke tax-exempt status. They have lesser sanctions available to them. For example, an excise tax equal to 25% of the excess benefit is imposed on each excess benefit transaction between a tax-exempt organization and a disqualified person. If the 25% tax is imposed, and by the way, it's imposed on the recipient of the excess benefit. If the 25% tax is imposed and the excess benefit transaction is not corrected within the taxable period, an additional excise tax equal to 200% of the excess benefit is imposed on any disqualified person involved. So they first get hit with a 25% tax, and if they don't give the money back, they get hit with an additional 200%. That can run into significant dollars. If a tax is imposed on a disqualified person for any excess benefit transaction, an excise tax equal to 10% of the excess benefit is imposed on an organization manager who knowingly participated in an excess benefit transaction, unless such participation was not willful and was due to reasonable cause. An organization manager is any officer, director, or trustee of a tax-exempt organization, or any individual having similar powers or responsibilities regardless of title. So if your CFO is called controller, that may have similar powers or responsibilities to a chief financial officer, and therefore that person might be subject to a 10% excise tax if they knowingly participated in an excess benefit transaction. So how can a tax-exempt organization possibly plan to avoid these types of taxes? Well, payments under a compensation arrangement are presumed to be reasonable if the following three conditions are met. In other words, if you meet the following three conditions, we're going to talk about them, it creates a rebuttable presumption of reasonableness. Here are the three conditions. The transaction is approved by an authorized body of the entity, that would usually be the governing board, that is composed of individuals who do not have a conflict of interest concerning the transaction. And anyone who does have a conflict of interest should recuse themselves and leave the room. Second, before making its determination, the authorized body, the governing board, obtained and relied upon appropriate data as to comparability. Now they can get they can look at 990s from other organizations of similar size, nature, and location to determine what they are paying their, let's say their CEO, if that's what's being tried, if you want to protect that position salary. Or the tax-exempt organization could hire a consulting firm to do that for them and compile the data. Thirdly, the authorized body adequately documents the basis for its determination concurrently with making the determination. So they have to document what they did. So I look at this really, although it's three conditions, I'm looking at it as one thing, one overall process. The governing board has to approve the compensation based on data that they look at before making that approval, and they document what they did. If they do all three of those things, they create a rebuttable presumption of reasonableness so that should the IRS challenge the compensation of that person, the burden of proof falls on the IRS to prove that its compensation was unreasonable. However, if the tax-exempt organization does not do all three of these things, including documenting it, and the IRS challenges the reasonableness of compensation of, let's say, the CEO, then the burden of proof to prove that it was reasonable falls on the tax-exempt entity. So you certainly would want to do this each and every year, or at least each time the compensation is increased. The second area is lobbying. A 501c3 organization may conduct lobbying activities provided they do not comprise a substantial part of its activities. Lobbying is simply defined as an attempt to influence legislation, and there are two types of lobbying. There's direct lobbying, which is contacting legislators or members or employees of a legislative body for the purposes of proposing, supporting, or opposing legislation, while grassroots lobbying is urging the public to contact members or employees of a legislative body for the purposes of proposing, supporting, or opposing legislation. So we have direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. But there are certain things that are not treated as lobbying. For example, nonpartisan analysis and research, public education, such as distributing educational materials, and the provision of advice to a governmental body in response to a request. Also, grassroots organizing, litigation, and communications between the organization and its members with respect to legislation, unless the communication urges the members to lobby. And then lastly, self-defense lobbying. That is, communications to legislators regarding the organization's existence or tax-exempt status. If the organization feels that this proposed legislation that will jeopardize their tax-exempt status or their existence, and then they can communicate with legislators regarding that proposal. None of those are treated as lobbying. If lobbying activities are substantial, remember, they can lobby so long as it's not substantial. If lobbying activities are substantial, a 501c3 organization risks losing its tax-exempt status and may be subject to an excise tax. You should know that private foundations, which are also C3s, are subject to IRS penalties for any lobbying activity. And we have to know how to measure substantiality, and there are two tests: the substantial part test and the expenditure test. The substantial part test to determine substantiality, it determines it on the basis of all the pertinent facts and circumstances in each case. Now, the IRS considers many factors, including the time devoted by both compensated and volunteer workers and the cash expenditures devoted to the activity. And this is a very subjective determination, especially when you're looking at the activities of volunteer workers. Under the substantial part test, an organization that conducts excessive lobbying in any taxable year may lose its tax-exempt status and may be subject to an excise tax. But public charities may elect to use the expenditure test under Section 501H, and this is an objective test using formulas to set ceilings for lobbying expenditures. And these ceilings vary from 5% to 20% of exempt purpose expenditures, although they are capped at $1 million. No organization may spend more than $1 million on lobbying. Please understand that churches and private foundations may not use the expenditure test. Organizations may elect to use the expenditure test by filing Form 5768 at any time during the year for which it is to be effective, and then the election remains in effect until it is revoked by the organization. So it's easy to elect the 501H expenditure test. So how does it work? 501H establishes what are called lobbying non-taxable amounts based on a sliding scale of exempt purpose expenditures. And it sets really two lobbying non-taxable amounts. Total lobbying non-taxable amount is based on a table of exempt purpose expenditures. The more exempt purpose expenditures, the more you're able to lobby. There's a maximum of $1 million in total lobbying. The second lobbying non-taxable amount is for grassroots lobbying, which is just 25% of the total lobbying non-taxable amount. So if you happen to be at the maximum for total lobbying, you can spend up to $1 million on total lobbying. That's your lobbying non-taxable amount for total lobbying, but your grassroots lobbying non-taxable amount is 25% of that, or $250,000. They are not added together. Your grassroots non-taxable amount is $250,000, and your total is $1 million. One is included in the other. So what do exempt purpose expenditures mean? Because we're allowed to lobby a certain amount based on a sliding scale, a percentage of our total exempt purpose expenditures. This means the total of the amounts paid or incurred, including depreciation and amortization, but not including capital expenditures, the amounts paid or incurred by an organization for the tax year to accomplish its exempt purposes. It includes program expenses. It also includes administrative expenses paid or incurred for the organization's exempt purposes. And it also includes amounts paid or incurred for the purpose of influencing legislation, whether or not the legislation promotes the organization's exempt activities. So in essence, lobbying is included in exempt purpose expenditures to calculate the lobbying non-taxable amount for lobbying expenditures. Exempt purpose expenditures do not include fundraising expenditures. Expenditures in excess of either amount of excess lobbying expenditures, total or grassroots, in any tax year are subject to an excise tax on the greater excess amount. So if you're in excess of both lines, total lobbying expenditures and grassroots lobbying expenditures, take the larger of the two, and that's subject to an excise tax. In addition, an organization may lose its exemption if it spends more than 150% of either of its lobbying non-taxable amounts over a 4-year period. So if you're approaching that 150% after 3 years, you cut back in the 4th year. But keep in mind that it's a 4-year total, a moving total. So the first time you do it, it'll be for years 1, 2, 3, and 4. In year 5, the calculation will be for years 2, 3, 4, and 5. So, and it continues to move. The law imposes a tax on organizations if they no longer qualify under Section 501c3 by reason of having made disqualifying lobbying expenditures. Keyword number 11, review. Review. Keyword number 11. Give you a couple of seconds more to write this one down. This is keyword number 11. The word is review. Okay, let's move on. Organization, I'm still on the expenditure test. Organization managers may also be liable for a tax on lobbying expenditures that result in the disqualification of the organization if the manager agreed to the expenditures, knowing that they were likely to result in the organization's not being described in Section 501c3. This goes back to the previous bullet, where there's a tax imposed on organizations if they no longer qualify under Section 501c3 because they've made disqualifying lobbying expenditures greater than the 150% in a 4-year period. If that happens, then organization managers may also be liable for a tax. Section 501c4, C5, and C6 organizations may lobby. However, there is no tax deduction allowed for donations or membership dues used for lobbying. If you're a member of the AICPA, many of you might be, or the New York State Society of CPAs, no part of your membership dues or donations can be used as a tax deduction if those dues or donations are used for lobbying. So, Section 501c4, 5, and 6 organizations must notify its members that a portion of dues are not deductible because they relate to lobbying activities, or for that matter, a portion of donations, but usually it's dues. So they have to notify its members. Did you ever get notified by the AICPA or the State Society of that? Probably not, but here's why. An organization, well, there are two reasons. First, an organization does not have to provide the notice if it establishes that substantially all of the dues paid to it are not deductible by the members. Well, we know that most of the dues paid to the AICPA and the State Society are deductible by members. It's either deductible on their partnership tax return, if there is a part, or corporate tax return, if it's a corporation, or their individual tax return. If member dues are used for lobbying, and the dues are deductible by the members, and notifications are not sent to members, which is the common case, the organization, in this case the State Society, the AICPA, the organization must pay a proxy tax on lobbying expenditures, and they pay it with Form 990T. And what it is, very simply, is the New York State Society, if they're not notifying their members that X% of their dues are not deductible, then the State Society will pay a proxy tax equal to the corporate tax rate times the total amount of lobbying expenditures that they incurred. And the corporate tax rate today, I think, is what, 21%, something like that. The third area, political campaign activity. Section 501c3 organizations are prohibited from directly or indirectly participating or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. And this includes making or soliciting contributions for, on behalf of, or against any candidate for public office. It could be national, state, or local, or directly to a political party. Endorsing or opposing a particular candidate or political party. Rating a candidate, no matter how objective the rating may be. Making statements in support of or in opposition to a candidate or a political party. Using the organization's resources. There's a typo, I want to change that. Just make a note, there's an apostrophe missing. Using the organization's resources, for example, office space, telephones, employee time, to engage in political campaign activity. And it includes not inviting all candidates to speak in a public forum. Now, generally, 501c3 organizations are allowed to conduct nonpartisan activities that educate the public and help them participate in the electoral process. For example, presenting at public forums and publishing voter education guides, so long as the activity is conducted in a nonpartisan manner. That is not considered political campaign activity. Violation of this prohibition, participating in political campaigns, may result in revocation of tax-exempt status and/or the imposition of an excise tax on the political expenditures. Also, an excise tax may be imposed against organization managers who agreed to the expenditures knowing they were political. The political campaign activity prohibition is not intended to restrict free expression on political matters by officers, directors, and employees of organizations speaking for themselves in their capacity as private individuals, but they should make it clear that they're speaking for themselves. So, for example, if a CEO of a 501c3 organization tells its employees that they should vote for a specific purpose, or that the CEO believes that vote for a specific person, or the CEO believes that this person will be better for their organization, that is prohibited political campaign activity. However, if in a private party, the CEO says to friends and neighbors and relatives that I'm supporting so-and-so because I believe he's the best man or best woman for the job, that's okay. But they should really state that what they're about to say is not in their capacity as CEO. More important for priests, ministers, rabbis, etc., because they're always on call. They're always acting in their roles as a clergy person. They should say, I'm not speaking for my pulpit, for my church, for my synagogue. I'm stating my own personal views. 501c4, 5, and 6 organizations are allowed to be involved in campaign activities so long as it's not their primary purpose. The expenses incurred in connection with such political activity, although allowed, are subject to tax. However, be careful. If a 501c3 organization provides funds to a 501c4, 5, or 6 organization that does engage in political activity, the C3 organization must assure that the funds are used solely for C3 type exempt activities and not for political campaign activity. That's really important. And we now come to the fourth and final topic that jeopardizes an organization's exemption, and that's unrelated business income. An exempt organization is not taxed on its income from an activity substantially related to its charitable, educational, or other purpose that is the basis for the organization's exemption. And such income is exempt from tax even if the activity is a trade or business. A C3 can have a trade or business so long as it's related to their charitable purpose. However, if an exempt organization regularly carries on one or more trades or businesses not substantially related to its exempt purposes, the organization may be subject to tax on its income from these activities. Use by the organization of the profits derived from this activity in furtherance of its exempt purposes does not make the activity substantially related to its exempt purposes. And what that means very simply is your activities must be related to your exempt purpose. If it's not, it could be subject to a tax. The fact that you're running a business, you're regularly carrying on a business that is not substantially related to your activity, just to raise money to support your related activity, does not make that trade or business related to your activity, to your exempt activity. So that's an important distinction. If you run a business that is not in furtherance of your exempt purposes, just to raise money to support your programs, that doesn't make it related. The tax on unrelated business income, that's UBIT, or unrelated business income tax, applies to most organizations exempt from tax under Section 501A. Keep in mind, everyone here from a nonprofit organization that's exempt, you're exempt under Section 501A as an organization described in 501c3 or 6 or whatever, but you're actually exempt under 501A. These organizations include charitable, religious, scientific, and other organizations described in 501c. Section 501c3 organizations may engage in income-producing activities unrelated to its tax-exempt purposes, so long as the unrelated activities are not a substantial part of the organization's overall activities. So we may engage in unrelated activities, so long as it's not a substantial part. However, it would be subject to a tax. Net income from such activities will be subject to UBIT, unrelated business income tax, if three conditions are met. The activity constitutes a trade or business. The trade or business is regularly carried on, and the trade or business is not substantially related to the exercise or performance of the organization's exempt purposes. We're going to go through each of these three conditions. The term trade or business includes any activity carried on for the production of income from selling goods or services. An activity must be conducted with intent to make a profit to constitute a trade or business. If you're running an activity and you have no intent of making a profit, then why are you running it? Probably because it's in furtherance of your mission. The activity itself is in furtherance of your mission. If your intent is to make a profit, that doesn't make it automatically unrelated. You can still show that it is related, but a term trade or business includes any activity carried on for the production of income from selling goods or services. An activity doesn't lose its identity as a trade or business merely because it is conducted within a larger group of similar activities that may or may not be related to the exempt purpose of the organization. For example, soliciting, selling, and publishing commercial advertising is a trade or business, even though the advertising is published in an exempt organization's periodical that contains editorial matter related to the organization's exempt purposes. Practical example, in my synagogue, we put out a monthly bulletin to all synagogue members. And it has articles from members and articles from the clergy and from management and from board people, and it has other things about upcoming holidays and services and other programs to be run in the temple. In the back of the bulletin are anywhere from 2 to 4 pages of advertising we accept from local merchants, many times just copies of business cards or a very simple advertising that the merchant puts in. And they pay us a fee for that advertising. By definition, selling commercial advertising is a trade or business. And that trade or business is not related to our exempt purpose, so it becomes unrelated business income for which we have to pay a tax. Now, we are allowed to deduct expenses against that. We'll talk about the expenses at the end of the session. But very common in the world of churches and synagogues. Some examples of unrelated trade or business activities. These are unrelated. Sales of merchandise and publications, advertising, debt management plan services. Let me stop there for a second. There are nonprofits whose mission is to provide debt management plan services to other nonprofits. That's their mission. That would be related. But if they're providing debt management plan services to individuals, that would be an example of an unrelated trade or business activity, because there's something called the commerciality doctrine. And the commerciality doctrine simply means that nonprofits, or I should say tax-exempt organizations, they're not necessarily the same. There are nonprofits that are not tax-exempt. Tax-exempt organizations should not be given a financial advantage over commercial entities because they do not have to pay a tax on their profit. That's the commerciality doctrine. So anytime a tax-exempt organization is competing with a tax-paying organization and they're performing something unrelated to their exempt purpose or their mission, it becomes unrelated business income, taxable income. Gaming is an example. Bingo is an exception, but other gaming activities are unrelated trades or businesses. We'll get back to bingo in a little while. There are some little glitchy things in there. And then rental income could be unrelated trade or business if there is an associated acquisition indebtedness. We'll talk about that actually on this page and the next slide. Exclusions from unrelated business income include, the basic exclusions are dividends, interest, and other investment income excluded from UBI, royalties are excluded from UBI, rents from real property are excluded. However, rents from personal property are not excluded. And there are special rules for mixed leases of real and personal property. Also, and it's not on the slide, there are special rules for mixed leases of real property and services. The services may be unrelated business income. Also excluded, gains from the disposition of property. Now, all of these exclusions, there's an exception if there's debt-financed income attached to the property. That is, when there's an acquisition indebtedness related to the property. So let's talk about income from debt-financed property. This is a generally misunderstood or not understood subset of unrelated business income. Generally, income derived from debt-financed property, rents, or investment income. So let's go back a slide. You see it there, rents. Investment income could be dividends, interest, other investment income, or gains from the disposition of property. So it includes everything here, including royalties. But royalties usually won't have acquisition indebtedness, but it could. Generally, income derived from debt-financed property is included in unrelated business income. So what is acquisition indebtedness? Acquisition indebtedness is the unpaid amount of debt incurred by an organization, one of three times. When acquiring, approving, or improving the property, you borrow money, that's acquisition indebtedness. Before acquiring or improving the property, if the debt would not have been incurred except for the acquisition or improvement. And after acquiring or improving the property, if the debt would not have been incurred except for the acquisition or improvement, and incurring the debt was reasonably foreseeable when the property was acquired or improved. Any of these, if you borrow money to acquire or improve property at, before, or after, that is acquisition indebtedness. So, if substantially all, now let me say one more thing before we get to the next slide. So how would this work? Let's assume you acquire some property for $1 million. And at the time you acquire it, you take out a loan for $800,000, just to make up a number. Okay. That's acquisition indebtedness. When you go to sell the property, let's say 10 years later, you have, let's assume it's land, so there's no depreciation. I want to keep it, so the book value remains at $1 million. But you've paid the debt down from $800,000 to $200,000. You would take as the numerator the average balance of the acquisition indebtedness. So let's say it was $300,000 at the beginning of the year, $200,000 at the end of the year. The average is $250,000 of acquisition indebtedness during that year, the year of the sale. That becomes the numerator. The average book value of the property, which is $1 million because we're not depreciating it, becomes the denominator. If it happens to be a building and you're depreciating it, then you would take the average book value beginning and the end of the year. So the numerator becomes the acquisition indebtedness, the denominator becomes the average book value. 250,000 over $1 million is 25%. 25% of the profit on the sale is subject to unrelated business income tax. Now there are expenses you can take against it. We'll get to expenses in a little while. That said, if substantially all, which is defined as 85% or more, of the use of any property is substantially related to an organization's exempt purposes, the property is not treated as debt-financed property. So in my synagogue, we used to rent out a portion of the building at times during the week, set scheduled times, to an itinerant church. They were there Friday nights, starting at, I think, 11 o'clock through about 2 in the morning. They were there Sunday in the afternoon and a couple of evenings. And they were limited to what space they could use. They could use the sanctuary, the lobby, and the men's and ladies' rooms. So we were able to do a calculation to show that substantially all, 85% or more, of the use of our property was related to our exempt purpose. Renting property to a church is not part of our exempt purpose. How did we do it? Well, I was the treasurer at the time, and I took two fractions. One was the square footage that the church used in relation to the square footage of the building, which was a fraction. And also I used another fraction based on time, how many hours a week they were there to how many hours a week we used the building. And I multiplied the two fractions, and it came out to under 15% went to their use, therefore more than 85% went to our use, taking into account percent of the building we used versus them, percent of time we used the building versus them. We fell under 15% that they were using, greater than 85% we were using. So the property was not treated as debt finance property, and we didn't have an issue. However, last bullet, if less than 85% of the use of any property is devoted to an organization's exempt purposes, only that part of the property used to further the organization's exempt purposes is not treated as debt finance property. So if we had come up with 80%, then 20% would have gone as debt finance property. But we came up over 85%. Excluded from the definition of a trade or business. Bingo, if it meets certain requirements. And that's in there for reasons that I won't go into. Obviously, there was some group that was lobbying. So bingo is excluded. Activities conducted for the convenience of members, students, patients, officers, or employees. Think hospital gift shop. Think a school store, student store at a college or other type of educational institution. Trade, convention and trade show activity is excluded. Distribution of low-cost articles incidental to the solicitation of contributions are excluded. Exchange or rental of member or donor lists between organizations described in Section 501 that are eligible to receive charitable contributions, sales of donated merchandise, and where substantially all the work is performed without compensation. And substantially, again, has been defined as 85%. For bingo, to be excluded from the definition of trade or business, the bingo game must meet the definition of bingo, and that excludes instant bingo. You've all bought these little prepackaged bingo cards that pull tabs, you pull 5, and if there's a match, you're a winner. That is not considered bingo. It's called instant bingo, but it's not bingo. Bingo also must be legal where it's played and played in a jurisdiction where bingo games are not regularly conducted by a for-profit organization. Meet all those three conditions, it's excluded from a definition of a trade or business. So we get to regularly carried on. Business activities are considered regularly carried on if they show frequency and continuity and are pursued in a manner similar to commercial activities of non-exempt organizations. For example, a hospital auxiliary's operation of a sandwich stand for 2 weeks at a state fair would not be the regular conduct of a trade or business, since the stand